welcome to Ryan Research. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. I'm joined today by Tony Chamas. He is an independent researcher with an upcoming book called Freedom to Change Nothing, The Spectrum of Managed Democracy and What Makes the U.S. Different. He also is the host and proprietor of One Dime, a YouTube channel, and he also has a Substack blog with great content, really exploring a lot of the intellectual histories and conceptions of leftism in general, but also all these different societal phenomenon that are going on in the past and today. So that is my introduction. How you doing, Tony? And please feel free to give your own introduction and own biography.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I also have the podcast One Dime Radio, which I'm far more active on. I upload every week. Podcasts often usually have a set of regular guests, but often new guests. It's more or less a more in-depth version of the stuff that I cover on the main channel and the podcast. The main channel is more video essays and documentaries, a lot of history and economics, if I were to pin it down, really. History, economics, history of ideas, history of revolutions, and economic ideas too. So covered a lot of MMT. I've covered the Cultural Revolution are some of my big ones, and uh, upcoming videos actually on the political economy of China and how China's system works. Yeah, and thanks for shouting out the Substack. I think that's how we connected. I'm proud of that. I still want more people to sub to my Substack because that's where my writing is at. And honestly, like I'm proud of my writing more than um, anything else. Honestly, like my writing is the part I take most pride in. And yeah, to introduce myself, I guess you pretty much captured most of it. I guess uh, I would say I'm quite heterodox as a thinker. I came from the left, so I've been in left wing spaces a lot, especially the Marxist spaces. In fact, sometimes if you Google my name, you'll see neo Marxist thinker, which is not really accurate because I don't consider myself a Marxist or a communist. But, I'm very influenced by that tradition. I spent a lot of time studying it, so I know a great deal about it. And I would say in general, like with like left and stuff, if you want to, probably the encapsulation of where I'm at politically would probably be a mixture of the two essays, which I know you read, like the concepts of left and right, the left and right binary is obsolete, and probably the Christian case against capitalism is another piece of mine that I quite like.
Great. So what would you say is the goal that you're pursuing with your research right now?
So, ambiguity where there is not a clear, obvious answer. That's what I always try to seek. Like I try to like what is a void I can fill, and it's different strategy, I guess, than okay, what is like a niche of audience I can already pander to in a different angle. That is obviously more advantageous, and especially on YouTube. But I find that very annoying. On YouTube, you get immediately you'll get a set of people who are very ideological now they approach things and they get really angry if you say something that goes against their ideology. um so that's kind of what happened to me with the left is accumulated all these left-wing followers and they really didn't like when I criticized the left, and increasingly I've been finding myself more at home with a lot of heterodox thinkers. So but like really the so like my political specific maybe alliances have perhaps changed, but the principles that drove my politics are kind of the same. Like I got into socialist left-wing politics and anti-imperialist politics for a very simple reason, which is, you know, to solve problems. Like I always thought, you know, we live in a first world country. There's really no reason we should have such a high homeless population. We shouldn't have a condition where you have people that work full time and spend the vast majority of it on rent to a landlord who is doing very little labor compared to what they're collecting in rents. I there's just a lot of problems that capitalism just hasn't been able to really solve quite well, like quite simply. And it's a paradox of like abundance. It's very good at consumerism. It's the best system ever created, and a
Mhm.
lot of things. It has a lot of benefits as a system. It's very progressive as a system. But there's also, what is the paradox of a system that has a declining population? Like, it causes a declining birth rate. It's destroyed the modern family,
Mhm.
communities, massive mental illness. So I seek is to like, how can we solve problems? So for me, socialism, communism, whatever, these labels are only useful insofar as they encapsulate specific solutions or ideas, and that's kind of what I'm trying to research. Also trying to research like the people who tried, why did they go wrong? Because I think that's the big thing. Is like you got to learn from the past. History to me is way more important than philosophy and theory. Philosophy and theory is very useful, and obviously, like it's influenced my work. You can give a vocabulary to articulate ideas, but history is really like the tool to see like what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and you get to figure out a problem. You have to know what caused it in the first place, and I think that that's the key to moving there. So yeah, I'm also a one person team largely. I work with video editors here and there, and some people who like might volunteer to help listen to the podcast, before it goes out. But like other than that, it's really just me. I'm the only writer and researcher here. But yes, long term, I would like to expand it. That's why it's like One Dime was originally, I didn't even, I wasn't even on camera in most of my videos. I originally wanted to make it like a sort of team, but I was trying to balance it with work outside of this. So yeah, I guess there's anything else. My academic background is in political science, what I went to grad school for. Um, and I worked in the public sector for a while and private as well. So it's kind of yeah, the set of things that brought me to the left are pretty much the same. The difference is that I don't really care for these ideological categories. If you say you're a leftist, you have to be left wing on everything. I'm just not. In some ways, I'm quite socially conservative. But to me, like that's not a contradiction in a practical sense. It's a contradiction to someone who's very ideological. But to me, like okay, if you want, isn't the point of like a socialist policy or a social democratic policy, whatever term you want to call it, isn't it to conserve like civilization? And that's for me how I see it. It's very about conserving civilization, improving civilization. It's pro human agenda, and that's how I would view it. It might sound all vague, right? But that's what concerns me. Like I don't know, to put it more simply, I would just say like Tupac Shakur, who I like I did a video on just because he has that one clip where he's talking about like the problem with wealth inequality
Mhm.
and the ridiculousness of it all. And I think he like makes the best case there. You don't really need to like to me, I don't think like exploitation of surplus value, the way Marx talks about it, is really like compelling. Is to what is the problem with the system? I view it as a problem of excess. You shouldn't have a society if people are too poor and a society if people are too rich. I
Mhm.
don't believe in like a you equalize complete equality or whatever, like, or end exploitation, end alienation. It's like no, I think it's far more simple than that. And also maybe after that maybe we can think about other problems. But for now, it's like to me it's like what is the problems of civilization? Well, it's like
Mhm.
planetary collapse. I mean, you have the ecological collapse. You have human decline, birth rate decline. Uh, clashes of civilizations, right? I think in Europe especially, and yeah, I mean stuff like that. Really, class
Great.
war,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which I don't think compared to the accelerations, I don't think is necessarily gonna be a good. I don't think that necessarily ends in a good way. You know.
Yeah. So that's great. So this is where, for the listeners, my desire to have Tony on uh, is based in my observation that he starts from the left and he's undergoing a critique of the left. And as he's described in part, dissolving some of this surface level left right binary. And I find myself on a mirror image starting in the right and dissolving and critiquing my way into getting rid of that surface level left right dichotomy. And so we're actually, in a way, kind of, I feel like meeting in the middle. And so that's where I think this is a productive conversation to have. And what's interesting when you discuss your study of history as much more important than kind of staying in the narrow confines of orthodox Marxism or its various tangents, is that you find examples like Tupac kind of having an eloquent analysis of wealth inequality. But is that necessarily within the confines of that narrow uh, box of Marxism, which may or may not be the case? In a similar way, by my process of studying history, I find that there will be instances of claims of the sky is blue. And this can be inside Marxism. This can also be in many other traditions, can be said earlier than what Marx has said. And so I don't necessarily see Marxism or its various tangents as a necessary singularity, which I think it often is the case when I'm talking to leftists, is that you must go through Marxism to sort of have an objective analysis because it's, the study of history and blah, 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 blah. But when I actually study history fuller, you find people that did not have the singularity of Marx because they came earlier, because they were dealing with traditions that were in many ways things that Marx himself criticized as perhaps like bourgeois or feudal or so forth. And so I look at characters like the senator from New Hampshire in early America, Daniel Webster. And if you read his material, he, like you were talking about Tupac and wealth inequality, Webster is actually talking about inequality in terms of property. And so as he's seeing America develop and he's seeing, human farmer moving into textile factory society, blah, 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 he is seeing how the problem of all these elites sort of monopolizing property and the common folk kind of getting relatively less property as a problem of American democracy. And if he sees if this is left to just entropically keep going, it's going to harm American democracy. And so he starts to make this critique. Well, if we want to preserve American democracy, we have to maximize the equality of property. Now, how do you get there? That's another conversation. But this is where I find building blocks like Webster very interesting, is that we can cobble together a more universal approach to these problems where, again, you concluded with saying your goal is not necessarily to prove Marx was right or to further the doctrines of Marx. Your goal is something larger and older, which is the preservation of civilization, however that might manifest.
Certainly the evolution of human civilization, right? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
like, preservation can be taken as like conservative, like in the sense of, you want to conserve the current civilization. And I would not call myself politically conservative. And I actually think that politically conservative people today are largely tend to be liberals. It's like the people who rationalize what's happening is like, oh, this is the way it is, or it's actually good, or the people who celebrate decay as progress. I think those are the political conservatives of today.
Mm-hmm.
um there's also like the trap of reaction, which I think reaction is often justified because it does often get at the problem and at least like recognizes a problem as a problem, but it usually doesn't. It's like it's just reactive a lot of the time. It'll harken back to a past, or kind of without really like, going at a solution, or missing, or ultimately like really understanding why the problem in the first place. And that's how I feel with the right on immigration. Actually, so, like, I agree with the right that the immigration is a problem. I think the political conservatives are the people who think, oh, okay, it's just, it's fine, it's whatever. This is just, oh, migration's always happened, so just deal with it. You know, no, I think it's absolutely a massive problem. In some places more than others, but it's definitely like overall not sustainable. I mean, Marx saw it as a problem too. I agree with a lot of Marx's diagnosis of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that Marx's solution was wrong, which is that, he kind of thought the problem would solve itself to some extent, which is like it would produce its grave diggers, and
Mm-hmm.
it would accelerate in a certain way, and then it would produce those grave diggers, and then the grave diggers would bring about revolution, and communism, and I don't really believe. I'm very critical of communism for all sort of reasons. Not just like actually existing communist quote unquote regimes, like Soviet Union, but I mean like even the idea itself, like it's real. As a real idea, communism. I have a set of essays coming out on that called "Why I'm Not a Communist."
Okay.
But That's a whole other thing. But it's also in terms of the gravediggers. I mean, the predictions is obviously wrong. Like capitalism does in some ways socialize production. That's why people think we're living in like techno-feudal corporate communist society. But the agent that's supposed to be the gravedigger of capitalism is supposed to be the working class. And the paradox is these sort of like this socialization of production. When I say socialization, I really mean like, you know, outsourcing family functions to bureaucratic functions, as well as socializing in the sense of no one really owning anything, like including our own, like, stake in the workplace, having a stable job, a home, you rent everything. All of this is actually like kind of crippling working power,
Mhm.
working class power. So the weird thing is, like, I just think like Marxism's outdated framework in the sense that like the working class is crippled by capitalism. It's not like capitalism continuing has like empowered the working class in a way that's allowed it to lead to this process of history. Like that's just obviously so wrong. Like it's just not, doesn't correspond with reality. So it's like, but in terms of the way in which capitalism works,
Mhm.
Marxism is very sophisticated, because I think without Marxism as a framework, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just seeing it like, oh, the problem is just one sector of capital. Like a lot of people love to only look at like finance, for instance,
Mhm.
or like the banks. The banks are the problem, or just rentism. And I certainly think that's the worst part of capital.
Mhm.
The one that is most easily you're most easily able to tackle. But like it's important to have that broader structure, especially if you care about issues like, I don't know why I'm wagging this band-aid. So I was stitching myself up
Mhm.
while you were talking. But like immigration is driven by capitalist demand for labor. Like one
Mhm.
can't just think that like you're going to solve immigration by just like deporting everybody, because it's the capitalists who have way more power than like the right populist ordinary people have,
Mhm.
who ultimately want to have more labor. That's why like all those right-wing governments that say that they're going to stop like the mass migration waves, like Maloney, Trump, they actually expand legal migration,
Yes.
like through the visas.
Yeah.
So that's the paradox of it, right?
And on that observation, I recently, January, February, I published an article saying, I think the title was, "They don't jail the CEOs." So it was all about immigration and the idea that it was very much resonant with what you're saying. Uh, the problem of immigration is not really within the agency of the individual immigrant per se. It is in the agency of the employer that's creating the pull factor. And if you do not have the employer, like immigration in this regard, in the specifics of America, kind of stops. We can get into the European problem of immigration, which is kind of a push factor of American imperialism, but that's a separate conversation. Just for America, it's very evident that this is you could say, capitalist pull factor, and that there's a great essay that I cited in the Phenomenal World blog. I forget the author, but he analyzes this perfectly, is that it is intended to be a policy of limbo, where they both want the performative nature of strict, tough on borders enforcement. We can look at a lot of these performative ICE, as bad as individual acts of ICE might appear on the screen. Trump, in his first year, deported less people than Biden did in his last 2 years as president. So what's really going on here is a acceleration of what was always an American policy, which is to be somewhat tough on enforcement in a very narrow sense, but to have the porousness and the unenforceability on the level of the employer that's bringing in all these people and hiring them, because the second class labor is what America desires. So this is sort of all intended to work as it's functioning. Because if you have these people not as citizens and not, as deported or not allowed into the country, you have this great, from the perspective of the capitalist, underclass of laborers that you can get away with stuff, paying them lower wages, lower safety. They can't report you to any authority if you do something wrong, than you would with the native labor class. So this is why when you actually look at what is actually the legal regulation and the court cases and literally what CEOs of these businesses are going to jail, and simply put, they do not go to jail. And that is the individual immigrant that is receiving the harsh end of the stick if this stuff ever gets enforced, when it's really the employer that is most the problem. But while I would agree with the analysis that there's like this sense that there's a capitalist that is most benefiting this and thus sort of wielding uh, the sort of control of the system, I don't know if the class of capitalists is as instructive for me in the way that it would be talked about in Marxism, because I don't know if capitalists, the owners of capital, is that descriptive compared to, what would come before capitalists, which would be the owners of land or the owners of labor, and like feudal serfs or slaves. What I then see is a construction of, okay, yeah, you what we're talking about is like an oligarchy. And so we have really like a perennial divide between democracy and oligarchy. Leave monarchy aside because I don't think that's really that instructive a concept. It's really these two. Um, and that through time, we just have this tension between, is the oligarchy winning or is the democracy winning? And thus, like, is it the fact that capitalists own capital, which makes them unique? Or is it the fact that they have the monopoly on violence, the state, to enforce their ownership? Because it's like the key word is ownership, I feel. It's not capital. Thus, it's like the key word is not land or labor for the oligarchs of old. It is ownership. And what is ownership? But it is the subjective discretion of the state, i.e., the monopoly on violence, to enforce the ownership. Because if the state changes its mind, it could redistribute, it could reallocate, it could do all these sorts of things. So then it, like, the conversation becomes like the center point is the state. And this is then we can get into a whole conversation of, well, how do Marxists view the state, and what is the state's role? Like, and again, like there's different ways of conceptualizing how to go about the process of revolution or reform in regards to seeing the state, seeing a commune, seeing a dictatorship or the proletariat, seeing the praxis of how that all occurs throughout history, where Marxist revolutions or reforms have been tried. So, so my question to you with that diatribe I just gave is, do you agree, disagree, or synthesize what I'm saying about that capital uh, in the modern sense is not really the instructive variable, but ownership and ownership's relation to the state as a monopoly in violence is the instructive variable?
So that's an odd question, because I mean, I see first maybe it would be helpful perhaps to define some terms like what
Sure.
is capitalism. I mean, that sounds pedantic, but I think it's important because I mean, it has to do with ownership, right? Like
Yeah.
capital is all about ownership. Now, some people think that if you are like an anti-capitalist or against capitalism, you are against capital. Well, that is maybe the case if you are a communist.
Mhm.
There is no, like Marxists have acknowledged for a while, there is no like socialist mode of production. That's what has made socialism far more a vague, ambiguous category compared to that of communism. Even though communism has also come to mean something quite distorted as well, like, in the sense of government ownership of everything. But of course, no, it means like stateless, classless, moneyless society, communal ownership. I don't believe in the abolition of private property, even though I actually do think it's simultaneously true that private property is the root cause of all inequality, which Rousseau identified far before Marx, right? And so did many Christians, for that matter. So did the Catholic Church for a while.
Mhm.
But the irony is the Catholic Church kind of did something with communist doctrine that the communists would later do, right? Now, not communist doctrine, but you know what I mean, because they didn't have the idea back then. But like
Yeah. The
they kind
impulse.
of they use the idea of like merchants, for example, like the practice of being a merchant is bad, or excessive wealth is negative. But in practice, what they would do is, they would own the land and property, and they would become a class of their own, and that's kind of what ended up triggering the Protestant Reformation at the end of the day. Like, is the corruption of the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic, by the way, so I defend the concept of the Church and the Pope for all kind of reasons we could get into. But like, the fact is when it became a class, that caused the problem. But the irony, what I'm trying to say here, is that communists, what happened to communist governments? It was like communists wanted to overthrow capital, but they concentrated all wealth in the government in the name of socializing production. Socialization, but in practice, it just created a new class, a new elite. And I think, I do take elite theory very seriously. I'm very
Mhm.
influenced by elite theory almost as much as I am with Marx. In fact, I see it as almost its counterpart. I feel like it
Mm.
completes Marxism in some ways, because you have to look at class conflict through the elite, and you have to be realistic that there's elites that aren't necessarily capitalists. Now, to get back to that, capitalists. I think a capitalist is someone who derives the vast majority of their net worth from their capital as opposed to their income.
Mhm.
Like if you own, a lot of workers now own capital, like
Mhm.
401ks, obviously, right? But it's not their main income. Like, for example, like, my grandmother worked as a nurse her whole life, but, she invested in like, like an index fund and stuff, and she has capital, but like her income was through her whole life, like laboring, right? These
Mhm.
aren't moral categories, these are just subjective categories, right?
Mhm.
And I also am, yeah, as you know, because you've read my work, is I also don't even think that the capitalists are like the only class that is important in shaping society in
Mhm.
problematic ways. There's also like the professional managerial class, particularly the part of it that I like the term the symbolic capitalists, which are the people who own, who have essentially the most power in terms of the distribution of symbols, knowledge, discourse. People in art, media, academia. They are very influential in shaping narratives and the way people talk about things and ideology. I think that's a whole class dimension of class conflict that's important to pay attention to. I think if Marx was alive to see this happen, he would have very much cared about it. The only reason he didn't write about it is because literally, like, that was hardly a thing. The printing press was just like, the democratization of the press was still like fairly new. There wasn't a managerial revolution yet that would happen really in the, late 1800s to early 1900s. So, capitalism, capital has obviously existed prior to capitalism.
Mhm.
Like, the word capitalism didn't even come into existence largely till the 1700s with the word capitalismus. And
Got it.
there's a reason why Adam Smith, right, doesn't even use the word capitalism once in The Whole Wealth of Nations. I'm sure there's a translation here and there that might have interjected it, but in the original writing, there's no like capitalism.
Yeah,
The word,
my just
sorry.
in an essay I have coming up, I use the line that corresponds with what you're saying. Like capitalism wasn't really created by the classical economists. It was really created as a shadow of Marxism. Like sort of the sort of pre-Marxist socialists came about, sort of more of the orthodox Marxists came about, and then in their critique, they've kind of created capitalism. And then I view a lot of capitalists that like are unironic defenders of capitalism as sort of taking on the sort of conceit of being a foil to either proto-Marxist socialists or Marxists. Because again, I don't think Adam Smith, like you're saying, would describe himself as a capitalist or a defender of capitalists. I think he would describe himself as like, I'm someone trying to bring Roman virtue into the 18th century and also maybe protect my landed gentry friends from uh, sort of changing dynamics of history because he was Adam Smith wasn't really a friend, I would say, even of industrial capitalists as they were merging.
Well, the big difference between them is just the social relations that were changing, right? Like, Smith is writing about what is the Marxists tend to call, or what a lot of historians even call at the time, bourgeois society.
Sure.
Like, you have a change really, starting, some really say as early as like the Black Death, technically, in terms of like the emergence of wage labor when they had to start paying people to do work because there was not enough people. But really, like, you started to have a proto form of economy that was like nascent and didn't really like start to become a major type of economy until really the Italian city states,
Mhm.
where you have like a market based economy essentially.
Mhm.
But even then, like, those aren't really capitalist societies. Some have argued is a Dutch Republic a capitalist society because they had the stock market. It was the first society with a stock market, I believe. Sorry to clear my throat here. Capitalism, though, still not like thought of that way. It's like merchant societies, but there's still aristocracy. There's still a
Mhm.
clergy. There's a myriad of class hierarchies, and more importantly, who controls the state? Who's shaping laws? In the case of England, still up to this point, it's not actually capitalists. Capitalists gain power through parliament very gradually,
Mhm.
and these are just considered the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, starts as a middle class, right? The middle sort, as they were called, and emerges into a more powerful class, especially with the Industrial Revolution. So, like, there's a lot of debate as to when capitalism started. Some people like to project it all the way back to, like, the Italian city states, but I think that's entirely wrong because that's a projection.
Mhm.
If, like, I think the most accurate way to look at when capitalism began is when people started, calling it capitalism. And
Mhm.
then the question is why? Well, because something objectively very new changed during the Industrial Revolution, which is you have you know, what was the kind of promise and seeming prospect of bourgeois social relations society came into conflict with themselves. So, like, with the market society, the reason why Adam Smith is so optimistic is because this is kind of like abolishing, like, this is way more free and liberating than serfdom.
Mhm.
And at the time, it's also a society in which a large sector of society can actually own some property. So it's this idea of like everyone owning a little bit of property. It's why, like, really the thinker, like the like leftist, I would say, of bourgeois societies, like Thomas Jefferson. He believed in the kind of, some call it a one class society, actually. The idea of like everyone kind of owning a little bit of property. He believed that it's really the producers who should, you know, rule, and that's like a democratic idea. But this is still looked down upon by like the landed gentry, the um, people. That's why in England they had like class warfare within Parliament, within the House of Lords, within the Parliament, and the different parties. Like the Whigs were more pro-capitalist, conservatives more pro-aristocracy. You have the Labor Party emerge to represent this new class of people, which is a product of capitalism largely, which is that the proletariat, the working class, is a product of capitalism because capitalism, like, this is the key thing, capitalism isn't bourgeois society. Like, even a lot of leftists get this wrong.
Mhm.
Capitalism is bourgeois society in conflict with itself because you have this proletarianization where, like, now a lot of people are essentially wages. They don't own any property. They have nothing to lose but their chains, quote unquote. And why did that happen? That was like the enclosures. That was a set of laws set in motion that made capitalism the dominant mode of production. Because it's one thing to have like merchants, right, that exist and they trade, and you have a market economy. It's another thing that you need to depend on the market economy for your whole means of subsistence. So that's what marks capitalism as a definitive change is
Mhm.
under capitalism. It's not like, oh, I can like choose to, be like have a farm or like be a wagey, or no, like I have to literally sell my labor on a market to survive, and I have to buy the things on the market to
Mhm.
survive.
Mhm.
And that's what creates a system of independence. But it's also paradoxical because this system of like, wages of all these proletarians creates massive amounts of wealth, but also concentrations of wealth. So there's all these contradictions. That's kind of what Marxism comes from. And Marx did not create like capitalism as an idea. If anything, he was just jumping onto the socialist movement that was
Mhm.
already critiquing capitalism, which was the social question, because capitalism led to the
Yeah.
social question, right? And social question, which was this question of inequality, child labor, you know, what is to be done with all these people who are like, you know, don't own anything, right? Well, that was the social questions, literally how like so many modern movements came about. Like that was what birthed social democracy, which originally encompassed socialism, communism, many different
Uh,
tendencies.
as just a quick question to go back to your main point there, where do you pinpoint the location of the social question? Where did it originate?
Social question. I mean, well, the social question starts before the 1844 revolution. 1844 revolutions where you have the emergence of communism, because that's where like really like
Hmm.
Marx and Engels see that the um, attempt for the liberals, right, the reformers, the
Hmm.
people who were like previously very pro bourgeois revolution, didn't were not in solidarity with the with the social question.
Hmm.
Like they didn't really care enough to, uh, you know, no, they didn't really like. They sided ultimately with the people of privilege and of power, and that's the paradox of the bourgeoisie, right? Like they were the kind of revolutionary class for a while, but you started to see like 1844 revolutions. Well, now it's like a lot of them are actually quite comfy and like have something to gain from the current order, and they're like, okay, we had a reform, we had enough. It stops here, and that's why you start getting like I mean, that's really the emergence of liberalism as a coherent political doctrine, is kind of actually like a conservative reaction against the social movement in some sense,
So again,
wanting to prove very.
you're saying France 1840s is the emergence of a concrete social question and how that then becomes
Certainly
a
when it
prism.
crystallized, yeah, you
Yeah.
get like all these other socialists that Marx writes about in the manifesto, right? You got like
Hmm.
the utopian socialists, you got like Fourier, you got like Robert Owen, you got all these
Hmm.
different people. I mean, it's I would say it's before that, like 1830s is when it crystallizes, but it
Gotcha.
starts already like after really like first enclosures, and it's drawing on ideas that come from before. But like the social questions definitely like crystallized in the 1830s. And yeah, industrial revolution also has waves that produce subsequently waves of like movements, social reform movements, and radical movements. But yeah, like really, I would say the source that I informed for me, like when did capitalism start? It's Ellen Meekson's Woods, The Origin of Capitalism, which is she dates it essentially to the industrial revolutions, and when England started to essentially codify their legal system around a capitalist order. So like the implementation of enclosures that like not only now it's like not only do you have a market economy, now you force people to be part of the market economy, and you created a legal code that like protects the market economy in a way that it didn't before protects property owners. And you also create a modern police force that is meant to like kind of deal with these now huge inequalities and relative inequality.
Hmm.
Like relative inequality, what I mean by that is like that's really what causes crime. It's like it's not just like inequality, it's relative inequality. So people living side by side each other with vast differences in property. That's why you need a police force.
Hmm.
So it's like, yeah, that's where you get the emergence of a capitalist state that needs to kind of, you know, uh, keep this whole thing intact, right? And that's where
Hmm.
Marx comes into play, because Marx sees liberal attempts to kind of to deal with these contradictions, like when they say, okay, how do we create for the public interest? Well, he's like skeptical of the idea of the public interest because they're not really like
Yeah.
representing the whole public; they're representing some
He
people more than
he
others.
tongue-in-cheekly calls a lot of these people like the harmonizers,
Yeah.
which is kind of a direct allusion to the guy I was talking to before the recording, Henry C. Carey, who I'm kind of very focused on, who's one of his kind of key terms is harmony. So he views these guys as like, you don't get it. Like you see problems, you're trying to then use the state as sort of you know, a misguided and temporary salvo or salve for the issue when like you're just slowing down the process of history, um, which I think opens up the discussion again into sort of this conversation, like I was kind of getting to, of like the state is actually the instructive variable because as much as there is a uniqueness in form to the market economy and capital becoming much more important in substance, I just don't see that much of a uniqueness in regards to the oligarchies of old. And so it just, sure, with change comes windows of opportunity for both democracies and oligarchies to sort of jump in and assert themselves. And where we see the problems of capitalism, quote unquote, is the fact that social change, technological change has created this window, and the state has become more of a tool of oligarchy. And so it is up to then the forces of democracy to take control of the state and to use Marx's term that he used in tongue in cheek, and to use Carey's term that he uses earnestly, is you want to harmonize the society in order to prevent these things. And I think as we go about the praxis of Marxism, especially in the 20th century, that seems to be the reverse engineered method. As bad examples as you could maybe point out, and authoritarianism that comes along with that, there is sort of this return to the state as the central variable versus sort of the discussion within Orthodox Marxists, as I understand it, which is the dissolution of the centralized power. Is that it's not so, like there's the idea of the transitional state. There's the idea of, as you describe it in one of your videos, like low phase socialism, high phase communism. But like inherently, and this was the problem with the Bolsheviks when they took power, is that the one party state idea was criticized internally within Marxism, within that Russian context. And it was supposed to be the setting up of these decentralized factory councils and communes,
Soviets, yeah,
and it
exactly.
went the other way around. So this is where it's like you can use the state badly, and like there's sort of a mixed bag to like you can be authoritarian and still like do development of the industrial economy. But the point being, like the objective lesson that we're trying to extract here is like, is the state actually the vehicle versus like this thing that is kind of a side issue. And ultimately, if you do anything about the state, you have to decentralize it or you have to destroy it. I had a bit of a mouthful there talking about the sort of the state being the critical instructive variable because its relationship to the protection of ownership, whoever may hold it, and its ability to harmonize, develop, further socialize the sort of economic sphere. So with that being the case, why is sort of capital, the ownership of capital and the market economy unique? While it might be informed, but in substance, it is really sort of the same dynamic of oligarchies of old, where people had no choice but to sort of be a slave or be a serf, to sell their labor in a sense, to sort of have a slice of land to grow their own sustenance crops. Similarly, they just have to like participate in this new fangled market economy, but is nonetheless in a way getting to the point through oligarchies sort of centralizing their power. There's not much choice of labor that we would think of when we use the term market economy. So that's where I go. In substance, I don't see the unique critical evolution from oligarchies of old to the new oligarchies of capitalists today. And I see the critical fight, which is perennial, which is that simply technological change and societal change led to a window of opportunity for oligarchies to seize on the state, capture the state. And we are then thus in just a tension between the reassertion of democracy on the state to sort of reset the system. So take it away.
So there's a lot of complexity here. But
Go, put me in the wood chipper.
why is
Go for it.
capitalism a useful way to think about things? Well, because in some sense it is a total system with you know a system that has a totalizing logic in the sense that it's totalizing tendencies. Its nature is to expand and expand into many spheres. So like when a company first, and it's a global system, so countries, if they want to succeed in a largely globalist capitalist economy, they have to play by the laws of competitive advantages, and that means finding new avenues to essentially marketize and exploit. And when you already kind of overuse those areas, you need to open up new areas to commodify. The nature of capital is expansionist, and it's not like it's the fault of capitalists, right? When you invest in a company, you expect higher returns. And when you start a company, you have to appease those investors, or else you're going to lose that capital, and it's exponential. It goes down, it goes up. And it's, there's a reason why capitalists can't like just suddenly like act ethical. Or why can't we just pay our workers better? Well, it's like you are competing with people who can just like not do that, and they'll beat you. They'll be able to charge lower prices for the same service, right? Um, and capital is a global system, right? So there's this central issue of capital mobility whenever you try to really do anything at the level of the nation state to merely like deal with inequality. Well, you know, with the exception of like landed property, capital is very fluid. Capitalists that invest capital in companies can move it abroad in response to things like high taxes and whatnot. And that's why the nation state is fundamentally not totally adequate itself at solving a lot of these issues. And that's, this is my paradox of me. We can return to it, but I'll bookmark it here. Is an idea I've been developing is the idea of nationalist internationalism, which is I think we need internationalism, but I'm greatly critical of like this kind of cosmopolitan globalism that of today. But I think like it's obvious to me that like to solve a lot of the problems like national sovereignty or solve simple issues like inequality or immigration, they are fundamentally international problems which require international cooperation. So the paradox is to fulfill even nationalist goals, you need international cooperation. The nation state is not adequate itself because, like, for example, let's say, this is where I'll maybe critique like a current thing I see on the right. Like, let's look at Restore Britain. It's current, it's trying to outflank Nigel Farage and the Reform Party on immigration. Well, what's its economic program? It's trying to essentially deregulate and lower taxes to reindustrialize Britain in the hopes that capitalists will come back and invest in the country. It's like, well, industrialization, no amount of low taxes is going to make Britain more competitive in the world economy than like Vietnam when it comes to producing things. Like you're just not going to be able to lower wages that low. And if you want to produce anything, for capitalists to want to remain in Britain, they're going to like want to keep labor cheap. And what is the easiest way to do that? Well, you force people there to work for less, or you just import more migrants, which has been the strategy, you know? So you start to see immediately, like if you want to compete in this global capitalist economy over like, okay, how do I attract the capital? Well, you're competing on these terms, and to change that requires international changes. Now, is the vehicle to that necessarily workers of the world unite communism? Well, I'm very critical of that too, but I think merely at the level of like, organizing internationally for things like capital mobility is possible. And it's what Thomas Piketty advocates. And it's even what some people on the right are starting to see as a problem. Like, for example, Meloni has understood that like a large part of third world migration is linked to the kind of bad living conditions of a lot of countries. That's why she tends to, give France a lot of criticism for its colonialism. It's owing debts, and she proposed the idea that all European countries should forgive debts on Africa in exchange for coordination on strong border control, to prevent migrants from entering Europe. Stuff like this. And so I think at the level of solving problems, at the level of like communist world order, I feel like the problem with Marxism is that it kind of injects its wish fulfillment into its objective analysis, which is its idea for like a world communist system. But at the idea of capitalism being this total system, why it's important to look at that and not just merely like, oh, the oligarchs or the elites. It's also because you're, in a sense, like it's the with if you just got rid of the elites, you'll get new elites who have to abide under similar conditions. And it's not just even, like when it comes to oligarchy, I think that's a big factor, and Marxists absolutely undermine, or not, I would say undermine, understate the importance of democracy, because part of where Marxism was outdated in terms of Marx's own writings is when he was writing, the state was literally controlled by capitalists, like in a very literal sense, or at least by property owners. Like, there was not like full suffrage yet. And old suffrage movements were, only just growing with like, the Chartist movements in England and whatnot. So he didn't really live to see modern democracy. So like I would say like democratizing the state is a first step in what you can do. Because obviously if you have like a corporate captured state like the United States, it's going to be really hard to do anything. But that said, we see like a lot of countries in Europe, and even like, to some extent, like, a lot of even the United States prior, was less corporate captured, and yet they still have policies that are, function that acquiesce in service of capital, right? Why is that? And it's because they're participating in this global economy. And so the changes will involve the state, but they also have to involve society in tandem with the state. The emergence of capitalism can tell us with how the emergence of a post-capitalist order could happen, which is that capitalism began somewhat organically in the sense of bourgeois social relations, but didn't become a system. The capitalist system until it was, some would say, provisioned is the technical economic term by the state in the sense of like legally codified, right? Through like property rights, through enclosures, through all of that. So like it's twofold. You need something to merge in society, but also in the sense of you do need the state, but in an international world system, that means many different states, not just a single nation state. So I do think the state's important. I think these attempts at like workers' councils didn't really go very far. And we're also not in a situation where the workers are empowered in the way they were before. I don't actually think the working class is the only agent of social change. Like I think that's also outdated. The working class is it just has, before Marx's whole thing was that he believed in the working class because they had the interests and the power to change society. I think they still have the interests, but the power, that's not really. No, actually, they're far less powerful. Like people don't believe me when I say this, but unionization rates in like America, for instance, are like, I think they started to recover a little bit under Biden, but they're like lower than they were during times when like unions were illegal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Still in the process of before, like I'm talking before FDR, before like the
Yeah.
legalization of unions. That's crazy to imagine, but that's because like the reason people don't organize today, it's not because they lack class consciousness or whatever. It's because you'll literally be fired and replaced by an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is quite literally why. Or like the fact that, or your factory just might be shipped abroad. Like now workers fight to keep their jobs, not to like raise wages or turn them into worker cooperatives. So, there is some extent in my view, the new class conflict in the immediate contradictions is between really the producer class and the rentier class,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that that is like a one where you can leverage, because and what opened my eyes to this was the trucker convoy in Canada.
Okay.
As I saw, they made damage. People like to regardless of what you think of how they saw COVID, whether you believed in a different COVID policy, regardless, what they did functionally worked, which is they shut down, trade between the U.S. and Canada in an effort to force the government effectively to end lockdown, to end vaccine mandates, really,
Mm-hmm.
and to like let people go back to work and resume life as normal. Regardless if you agree with that objective, that worked, and that was considered a problem. I mean, the government had to literally do like very authoritarian stuff to shut that down, like freezing bank accounts of some of the activists, the participants. And who are these people, the convoy? They're like what Marx would call the petite bourgeoisie, the small property owners, leveraging the fact that they, still like a lot of the economy depends on them. I think it is
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of the restaurant owners, the people who own a bit of property but produce, they don't like earn all their wealth from like just the property. They, in fact, a lot of their business is based on their own labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think like coalitions between people like that and even people like skilled professionals is an important basis of class conflict, but not in the sense of like this is going to all lead to the abolition of class in the communist sense. I just think that you need class conflict as a realist lens, because, or else, what is incentivizing politicians to stick to their promises? If you just look at electoralism and say, let's have a political party,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I believe in doing X, Y, and Z. Well, the reality is there's different power blocks who are going to pressure that politician and that government, and the capitalists are going to be very quick to try to pressure them. Not just through money, but through capital flight, various things. But if the people whose labor and services are like necessary for the society to function have the power to withhold that and leverage that, that's a counterweight to that, and that also forces governments to actually like stick to their promises, because like this is the reason why both people on the right and left need to be elite theory pilled.
Mm-hmm.
That when people in government are in power, they don't necessarily just stick to their ideals. They're now a class that wants to maintain their power. And that's my case for democracy. Democracy is not the best system. I hope we one day figure out a better system than democracy. And
Yeah.
and I'm not like, and I say democracy like what we have now is managed democracy. It's not like real democracy, but I don't like representative democracy and what we have now. Its only virtue, in my view, its main virtue is simply the division of power. Because when you have people who are elected in positions of power, they're going to act in different interests like that, whether it's communist, socialist, or whatever. That's why I don't believe in like a dictatorship of the proletariat represented by a vanguard party, because they're just going to be a new elite. That's what happens every time. Like what happens every time in actually existing socialist experiments, some better than others. But like, let's look at like, especially the decolonial movements that call themselves socialists in Africa. All of them literally redistributed the wealth to their friends. Let's look at like Rhodesia, right? Or is that what Zimbabwe, right? Like took it from the property owners, white property owners, and what? Like they spread it literally to their cronies. You had this in so many cases, and that's because of elite theory.
Yeah.
This is a new elite, and you need to be mindful of that. And so should right wing populists, right? That's why like no one should be surprised why Trump and MAGA is a disappointment. Like Trump came to power by appealing to popular sentiments, but what's going to determine whether Trump does something that MAGA, like I'm talking like the populist base of MAGA, likes? It's not going to be Steve Bannon convincing him or Tucker Carlson convincing him. It's going to be the people with power to like pressure the government, pressure the state. And the MAGA just doesn't really have a leverage of that. Like at the end of the day, it's going to be like lobbies like AIPAC, Saudi Arabia, or like power blocks that have far more power in influencing that government. So you need a counterweight, and that's for me why Marxism is still useful. Is like class conflict is a lens in which you need to counter the power of the elite somehow.
Yeah.
And it's like you either have to like you either go Pareto's way, which Pareto like was so elite to repeal that he just thought, okay, we need to pick our elite that we prefer to counter the other. And that's what Trump's project, I think, essentially was. It's like this: they try to appeal to a certain sector of the tech elite, another sector of the Coke elite of this like alliance. But what is that delivering for the MAGA base in terms of like what it wanted to see with migration, what it wanted to see with farmers, the white working class, whatever. It's ultimately been like an Israel first government, if we're being honest, in terms of like Trump. And it's like, well, there's nothing you can do about that because there's no power that like the populace, the little guys in MAGA have. That's why, like I'm so pro union. I'm pro, like organizing, cooperatives, various forms of class power, because it's like, how else are you going to make shit happen? That's the reality of it. So I approach class in terms of a realist lens, not in terms of like you need class conflict so you can abolish class or whatever. It's like, no, it's the point of it is that there's different interests. Like, I'm sympathetic to harmony, like in theory. In theory, I'm very sympathetic.
Embrace the harmony.
By the way, I get called a class collaborationist.
Okay.
Some Marxists like to call, they'll say like I'm just a radical social democrat, and by that must mean I'm like a fascist because they think social democracy is a moderate wing of fascism or whatever, and that because you believe in class collaboration. Because what I'm advocating is, in a sense, class collaboration, but it's still class conflict. I'm critical of the harmonizers because I think we have to be always real that there are some people's interests who are going to completely diverge. You're not going to appease everybody, but the goal is like you do need class coalition. So that does involve class collaboration. But the problem with harmony, if you talk about the people or whatever, it obfuscates the fact that some people just want different things in society.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be able to appease. There's going to be winners and losers.
So, okay, so this is a good segue into the presentation of harmonizers within Marxism, which is this naive group of intellectuals that perceive, if everyone could just get along and if capitalists could be nice, we'd live in utopia. So I think that's often the presentation when I read into Marxism. But again, when I read the harmonizers, like there is actually very much conflict within their writing. And so to go
To
back
be
to
clear,
my,
I'm not necessarily talking about like the people you were reading, because the
sure,
people you were telling me about before we started the show is people I'm not familiar with.
sure, sure.
I'm more thinking about like, you know, a lot of like literally like a lot of the reform movements and governments that have taken power, whether it is from like, you know, populist like Disraeli or more recently FDR. Like there are there are attempts to like harmonize class conflict, but even that came on the back
Yeah.
of class conflict.
Well, don't even get me started on Disraeli. But just to return to my point, so when you read into Carey, and I understand and appreciate that you may not have come across some of these writings, but just to say that much of Carey is embedded in what people might describe as like bourgeois social democracy because of the relationship between um, I'm going to say like this like nexus of a conversation between France, Ireland, America, and Germany, that through the 17th century to the 20th century, this conversation is happening. And then you could say like some of that conversation goes over to East Asia, and I can get into that maybe later. But point being, when you read into the writings of Carey, Carey is not saying by harmony, if everyone could just live nicer and we all just be passive, then society gets better. What he's saying is that just as like Marxists would say this, like there are relationships within a market economy or any sort of human interaction which can be good, like just can be like, people are have noble interests. Those exist as a category. And so what Carey's saying, he divides his world of political economy, or as he would call it, association, into commerce and trade. And he would prefigure what I would say, like a Michael Hudson would describe as productive and unproductive. And you resonated with that dichotomy with when you talked about productive versus rentier interests. And so Carey is describing this divide between, the people that are productive, the people that are sort of trying to operate in a sort of noble end, and then there are the people that are engaged in trade. And again, it's sort of maybe not the best word choice because these are very like similar terms, but Carey is saying commerce is all about like kind of fertility. It's prosperous. It builds on itself. Again, this gets into a conversation in a more technical economic way of what is increasing returns to scale. What do we mean by that? What is technology? What is technology's role in production? Um, we could even get more statistical about that. But just to say, like that is what he's trying to get at with the term commerce, and by trade, he is talking about basically everything that kind of is an impediment to the uh, progression of commerce. And he'll make a spectrum of degrees where there's sort of necessities of trade, which he'll kind of put at the most benign as sort of like a ship that needs to move commodities from one place to the other, or sort of a storefront that is the middleman between. But he would look at further down that spectrum as people that we would call these rentier oligarchs, and he would view them as sort of the most uh, insidious impediments to productive forces or commerce. And so this is where he starts to formulate, okay, so like, yes, there is conflict. Yes, there is uh, a place that we need to go to that is not just passive, everyone be nice utopia. There is actually something we need to do about these people in trade and the most insidious of them. Um, Now, how do we do that? In Carey's point of view, you do this through the state. So this is where I think a lot of reading of Carey gets caricatured as like libertarian, Jeffersonian in a sense, which is almost like a bad description because he was on the other side of that Federalist debate against Jefferson. But like he's sort of just let capitalists do capitalist thing. That is what the caricature is. And there's this idea like he doesn't like the centralized state, but it's like it's kind of a much more complex and nuanced conversation because his literal description of the state is that it is the brain to the body of society. And so he goes to pains to describe this relationship where it is not the brain's role to digest the food as such as the stomach. So it's like this is where the nature of what is the role of the state and why can you have a strong centralized state power in relation to actually an autonomous, decentralized sort of sphere of socialization. But nonetheless, the brain has such an important role in sort of ordering the body, of sort of not just intervening again, because this is where it's like we have the interventionist night watchman state. We have, again, sort of these ideas of anarchism, whether from the right or the left. And it just misses the point of this sort of, in a way, beautiful contradiction of centralized state power can beget higher levels of actualization of the individual. And so this is the stuff that Carey is trying to flesh out. And so then it's the quest of, well, how do you arrive at a state that can do that? And this is the kind of like the next step of what Carey's project is, or for he's setting up the stage for those to come after him to kind of figure that out. But it is essentially just the question of politics, the question of oligarchy democracy. It's the question of ultimately, to kind of go back to more of a perennial quote, authority comes from reason, and thus reason begets authority. And this kind of goes back to a medieval Irish monk named Euregina, which is who Hegel said is somewhat of a forefather of his philosophy. But the point being is that, like the actualization, and maybe I could be using and paraphrasing wrong, but the dialectical process of reason is sort of the direction you must go in to kind of create an ethical state to go out and rectify this conflict between the commerce people and the trade people, and then you will get a more harmonious situation. And again, like this is where it gets hard too to sort of always describe things perfectly, because it is not just sort of domestic class relations as Carey would describe classes in that sense, commerce, trade, but it's also sort of like so much of what their conversation is national versus sort of, international, I think is a misnomer, but it's like the more appropriate term is imperialism, because Carey is in a conversation with critiquing British imperialism. And so the impetus of his nationalist focus is to counteract the forces, both explicit and implicit at his time, of British imperialism coming in and subverting the American project. So that's where you almost have like a quadrant chart of like commerce and traders, or like rentiers and productive people. And then you have another axis of sort of the national versus the imperialism. Because again, international is just like, it's in a sense, we're all internationals. And it's like somebody that can get into the weeds of what academics think of my chosen master's, global history. Like global history would posit in some sense, like we're all global. There's nothing other than the global, but there are these instantiations of nations and nation states and so forth. So that's why I think imperialism is kind of a better term, because it kind of is getting at the kind of global scope of an imperial structure, but ultimately it's sort of centered in a particular metropole. And as I kind of like, I've written another recent essay talking about the nature of British imperialism in the 19th century. And it is my regard, as other scholars that I've kind of quote there, like Hopkins and Kane, is that imperialism takes on the logic of oligarchy more so than I think more broad criticisms of it as like it is the entire nation and even the entire capitalist class of Britain that is perpetuating and driving imperialism across the world, when it's actually shown to be that is like imperialism is actually a drag on the progression in both like a social question sense, but also just in a developmental sense, which pertains mostly to the industrial capitalists, from like Britain advancing. And so like imperialism was kind of an anchor on Britain as it kind of came through the 19th century, especially as it was competing with France and Germany that were kind of starting to rise above, and of course America. So So this is where like you kind of can get back into this thing of like the project of like a Carey's vision that would go against just like kind of the capitalist versus working class conflict is that if you can ameliorate the problems through an ethical state of productive commercial people and unproductive trader people, rentiers, and the imperialist element versus the nationalist element, then you can actually create a better ordered society. And then as we get into the 20th century, where we really have the praxis of certain Marxist states come to be, we can kind of get into the Russians, but I like the East Asians more. When you start to see that, you do start to see what scholars have solidified as state-led development across East Asia. And
When
this
you
would be
say
a
East
curious
Asian,
idea.
are you talking about like Japan, Singapore, China?
I'm talking. I
Those kind of
view
models?
China, Vietnam,
Tiger
Japan.
economies.
Yeah, I'm saying that there is much more of a shared overlap to the conversation they're having with each other or they're observing amongst each other than we give credit for when we just say, well, China developed through a Chinese, what are you going to call it? Socialist system with Chinese
Yeah,
characteristics.
but there's a crucial reason why all those
Yeah.
countries got rich.
Are you going to tell me export-led development?
Well, it's they got rich on the terms of the global capitalist economy. I explain this in my next How China Works video, which is like it's state-led development, but there's been many state-led development, and there's a reason why like a lot of countries cannot simply do what China and Vietnam do. I mean, with Singapore especially, Singapore is a really odd case.
Mhm.
Singapore literally got rich, as Lee Kuan Yew admitted, partially due to the fact that China was still communist, the fact that they needed a country as a buffer between Hong Kong, Britain, Singapore. Was a perfect kind of economic um, powerhouse, for capital to be invested and reinvested. That's why the banking sector is so big, and the finance sector more
Mhm.
broadly. But with China, like the reason why it can produce as much as it does, and as well as it does, is because it had a good education system and a gigantic population where the price of labor is simply very low. So it's like you get a recipe there for like goods being made very cheaply and quite well. That's why like made in China, especially now, is not even like a bad thing. Like especially as the economy has evolved. But like that's why so much capital went into China. Like and initially it wasn't even Western capital. It was like capital from like Hong Kong and Singapore, largely coming from there. But that's why it's like this is the global economy we're talking about, and that very global economy is why some countries cannot solve problems. Like it's why like I think like when was Carey writing, right? Like it was around Marx's time, right?
His principal period of output was, I would call it like 1830, and I think he died 1874. I have that right, and he was pretty prolific up till then. Um, so yeah, he's doing that. But then this gets into again one of the ingredients of Carey that's important is sort of a nationalized system of finance as a public utility, and that's where I think a lot of even like again like I can critique the East Asian economies as much as I think they're interesting case studies. Like there is a very like big critique with the development of South Korea, even though I would say the rightoid simplistic brain that sees South Korea as a capitalist utopia that just let free market CEOs do whatever they want is wrong because
Do they think that?
well, I'm saying like
That'd be crazy.
when you see the meme of like the lights out in North Korea and the lights are on in South Korea, I don't you've probably seen that meme, right?
Of course, yeah.
So like the simplistic rightoid brain sees that as like, oh look, South Korea like let the CEO of McDonald's do his thing, and then we have like
Right.
successful GDP growth. And it's like
And like the
it's
lowest birth rate in the world, and like
well, that's a
the highest
conversation.
suicide rate, and
That's a conversation of modern
worst
South Korea.
gender war of any country.
But if you look at when Park Chung-hee came into power, with all the particular criticisms anybody wants to make of how he came to power and how he secured power, point being he followed the methods of state-led development, which was using the ethical state to sort of create the productive forces of society to incentivize industrial development and thus societal development. And so from like the 1950s through 1979, when Park Chung-hee unceremoniously exits the world stage for reasons, I mean, this is what made South Korea successful, and is like, okay, modern South Korea after that retains some of that, does bad things that kind of goes against it, creates sort of the problematic, as you say, economy that like has these problems of fertility and so forth. But the point being, like, where I was most interested in is like, how are these countries going from one stage of development to the next? That's not just like it happens because it happens. It happens because there are specific policies applied that incentivize things. But even though I would say that is a merit to the conception of state-led development as a evolution of the Careyist philosophy that I'm speaking to in America in the 19th century, I will critique that, as you were sort of saying, as part of a capitalist global economy, because I don't know if South Korea could have done that without the demand from America, because so much of early South Korean exporting was going into supplying the Vietnam War that America was doing. So it's a very good debate to be had there. But I think while you can have the debate, I still think, even though, like you say, well, other countries have tried state-led development, but it doesn't work out. But it's sort of like, I don't think that's sufficient. Like, yeah, people could try it.
I'm not
It
against
could not
state-led
work.
development, by
Yeah,
the way. I come from the MMT world. I'm more sympathetic to Keynesianism and MMT
yeah,
than I am in terms of like a Marxist economic policy,
yeah,
because I think Marxism is great at critique, but when it comes to solutions, there's
yeah.
not really a lot to work with.
But if I
But
could tie
like,
the bow
yeah,
quickly, and then I'll let you go back just on this, is that the goal is to figure out through reason, like, what is the best state-led development application. And that goes back to Carey and MMT in sourcing. And again, MMT comes out of Kansas. We go back to the Midwestern populists and how they come out of Carey. Um, Point being, the sort of vision of perfecting a state-led development model and sort of taking it out of a capitalist matrix, which, like, in terms of the global reach of it, is like, I'm more associating that with imperialism, with a centralized core of oligarchs, than I am with sort of like, you have to participate sort of necessarily in sort of a capitalist internationalism. I'm talking about then, like, what a lot of these countries did as well is that they like nationalized the financial sector, and they created state banks that were creating credit to give out to the people. And this would actually coincide with a lot of the ideas of MMT, that it's like money is kind of not real. Like, there is no actual limit of the supply of money or the supply of credit. Uh, Vis-a-vis, what your resources and labor are that you can actually actualize in that sense. So credit is not the thing that's really constrained, or money is not the thing that's being constrained. So you can, through a ethical state, create a nationalized public utility of a finance sector that can actually issue credit in a state-led development model. So, and again, I think you find these examples embedded in the stories of how South Korea developed, how China developed, how Singapore developed, how Japan developed, in its various versions. You find state banks coming in and actually expanding credit nationally. And then this breaks with one of these like core impediments that you were describing, of like, well, you need to participate in the capitalist global economy because you have to attract capital to your nation. So you can't get out of that. But if you have a state bank that's nationalized, you don't kind of need to do that. You can kind of create the sphere of economic activity and stimulate it, and then keep building off of that. And again, I think that's actually much more resonant with like how we conceive of what China's doing today, is that they do have a better grasp of the necessity of controlling their domestic financial sector, and the ability to pull that lever when they need to, even though they're engaged sort of in a imperfect process with the international global economy, which is centered in, New York and Washington, D.C.
I don't really, so I don't view the participation in the global economy as like the problematic thing. My point's not so much that it's like, oh, that's like the problem. I'm just saying that that is like the whole basis of their success. Like
Yeah. Well,
the
no,
state-led,
I'm debating that with you. I'm
yeah,
saying like the
yeah,
necessity. of the global economy. Again, I view that as you can do that, you cannot do that, you can export, you can import. I'm not
Yeah.
really getting into like, do you just become autarkic? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the centrality in a in sort of like this is just an objective fact. You have to do this. You have to participate. I don't think to the degree that you have to as a predicate for successful development. I don't think that's the case because of the nationalization of finance. I think like that's where this thing starts to break down, and that's exactly what Carey was starting to write about with the institution of the National Bank of America and the subsequent creation of like the greenback currency. So like, and unfortunately, like America kind of has a half-baked version of what that was as it went forward in time. It didn't kind of fully listen to Carey.
So this is when it comes to the debates about like, China, South Korea, the reason where like they could be useful for some countries perhaps that are developing with comparable population sizes, that you know want to develop their economy. But for developed economies, right, looking to solve problems, state-led development entails very different things. So like a state-led development, let's say, look, Keynesian policy, because I'll speak on that because I know more about than Carey. So like, let's say you did like social democratic policies in Canada or Australia or the US, all countries which used to have some semblance of that, right?
Yeah.
Like, what happened to that? Well, it didn't happen overnight, and it's or without like, or solely due to ideology. It's has to do with like competitiveness. So like, if the paradox is that if you wanted to, for example, like empower workers more, right, by giving them more ability to, let's say, have freedom to choose where they work. Well, we
Mm-hmm.
got a little taste of that during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So during COVID, there was all these stimmy checks. They gave all these stimmy checks, and they ran into a problem immediately. Well, you had the kind of dilemma where a lot of people did not want to go back to jobs for the same level of pay that they thought were shitty, and especially when you had rising inflation, you know, especially when you had rising inflation, it's like, okay, we're gonna only go back for this if like better conditions or better pay. Well, it's why you got rises of migration in all, virtually all developed countries during like the reopening post COVID. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because the capitalist economies were hit with this demand, which is like, oh, no one wants to work anymore. Migrants. That's why like Boris, you had the Boris wave.
Mm-hmm.
Biden had the Biden wave. Trudeau had a huge wave, and it's like, and that's why you got the rise of the anti-migrant sentiment. All come like it explodes even more, and like that has to do with the fact that this is a constant tension. Like every time you improve the workers at the level, at its slightest, in the slightest way, right? Like simply through like a stimmy check, which gave, did give a certain level of freedom in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of like, it was less good in the United States, but I remember in Canada for a while, you could get like pretty good checks if you were unemployed. And, that gave a certain level of power. I mean, it's part of how I started my YouTube channel in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it was kind of what like allowed me to start this, right? And a lot of people started a lot of their stuff that way. Now, from the standpoint of a capitalist, that's not like very ideal,
Mm-hmm.
for wanting to get people back to work. So there's this immediate conflict there. And because there's this it's an international system, you see very quickly the limits to, um, you see the limits of the nation state, which is like, let's say inequality, right? That's the key one. And in Europe, it's the most obvious, which is like every time there's the idea of a wealth tax. Well, what's stopping them from going to Belgium? So for me,
Mm-hmm.
what I propose in terms of policy right now is, I only think the only way to really tackle inequality at the level of the nation state, the most a nation can really do, is landed property. So in Canada, I frequently like to advocate um, for instance, like on a land value tax, as well as like a limit to how the quantity of residential properties one is allowed to own that they don't live in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, I'm talking homes, I'm talking like apartment complexes. There should be a limit as to how many of those one is allowed to own and just merely collect rent from. And of
Mhm.
course, there would be problematic loopholes that people would get around with this law. Obviously, like inheritance and all kind of stuff. Like there's still ways people would get around it, but I think you would close a lot of inequality because in Canada, many have noticed that like our economy in New Zealand is increasing like this, Australia is increasingly like this. The economy is actually like literally in terms of the GDP that like the politicians will brag as to whether it's high or not, um, is literally based on real estate. And like, but real estate going up is not good for a lot of the population. It's good for like boomers on paper who will own a house, maybe in just one house, but they can't even realize their net worth because there's no one who can afford to buy their homes. And that's the kind of paradox that you have now. Um, but really, like the big problem is that you can tackle is the people who own property that they don't live in. A lot of are actually foreign investors who don't even live in the country,
Mhm.
incidentally, or Canadian investors who will like leave the country and keep their properties. It's funny, kind of funny. I remember like just some friends of mine. They were like they had to do an interview with the owners of the place that they were trying to rent, and they were out in Sweden.
Mhm.
It's like why these people are in Sweden, right? And they're
Yeah.
collecting rent off a Canadian property. And I think that's easy to tackle because it's physical property for one, and it's not like the economy will suffer by
Mhm.
these people, losing some of their wealth. The same can't be said for a lot of industries. Like if you're trying to develop, let's say, like a tech industry in a country, you're trying to develop, you know, various different industries that require some level of foreign capital or even domestic capital to like get started.
Yeah.
Well, that like really can hurt your economy. If, for example, impose a wealth tax at a certain level, like in
But
Canada.
I'm kind of arguing the inverse. I'm saying like, taxes and the allocation of property and wealth is a sort of societal debate to be had. But I'm talking about the source of capital, which is you can say it is the existent pool of capital shared among global capitalists. Or as I'm sort of suggesting, is like, why don't you just use the MMT like power of a state run system of finance to create the capital? Like again, like there is no constraint on fictitious fiat money
What do you
or
mean
credit.
create the capital? Because from the MMT view, the money is not doesn't create the capital or the wealth. The money is just the unit of account. So like
Well, I'm
that's why
saying,
the MMT people are like you can't run out of money, but that doesn't mean you can't run out of resources. So like
yeah, like
you
I
can
said,
run out of resources,
yeah, I
and that's
said,
why like you can't just do anything with the money printing, right?
yeah, like I know the limit on MMT is actual like the real things in the world, like labor and like resources. Like that actually, when you hit up against the ceiling of that, that's what causes inflation. The point being is that to the degree that we do not have labor and resources utilized in the optimal way, like there's all this slack that if we then unleash the MMT money printer, we can then create a better economic outcome that does not hit the ceiling of inflation because of all these unused, unactualized units of labor and resources. So, with that being the case, if going back to your tech example, if what we're talking about by capital, like you don't want to like disincentivize like capital from starting a tech industry, are we talking about literally $200,000 seed investment checks that create a company of 5 people that have a couple laptops between them? If that's what we're talking about, that $200,000 can come from an MMT money printer. See, so like that's where I'm trying to get at. Like, I don't think we need this global pool of capital to be venture capitalists necessarily, which has many problems baked into it. As like I come from sort of observing that world up close, I'm like I have a lot of sort of notes and writing on like the realities of how that world works, and it doesn't actually always run optimally,
Well,
especially now.
that sounds like a kind of Soviet economy,
No, I
almost in
don't.
the
I
sense
don't.
that
That's a Colbert economy from like
yeah,
France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Like the point that I'm making is that there is an inherent uh, insight of you have society at development stage one and it moves to society at development stage two. And I'm saying if that happens as it did in France, in England, in America, or Soviet Russia, like again, this is where I got into a lot of debates with rightoids, is because no one could explain why there was stuff in the Soviet Union. Like again, like no one could explain as bad as you can say all these other effects of the Soviet Union rule was, no one could explain, well, how did they actually create material growth? Like they have factories, they were able to output industrial goods. And so that was the core insight that I was trying to extract from the peripheral like aesthetics and bad effects of the Soviet Union. And so that insight is what I'm trying to get at, is like it's the core logic of like state-led development and the statecraft behind that, which is a derivative of this other tradition of economics that goes back to people like a Friedrich List, like a Henry Carey, or like an earlier exponent, Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France, who was kind of like the modern kind of start to this, or like the intellectual I talked about who's still alive today, Eric S. Reinhardt. He goes all the way back to the Italian city-states as sort of formulating sort of like how to do this. So my point is that, like, I'm not saying you need like a full
Italian
authoritarian.
city-state sounds like an odd example.
I don't think it's, we don't have to get into that rabbit hole right now, but I'm saying like the origin point of the primordial ooze of what this state-led development theory is coming out of kind of starts at the Italian city-states, and it keeps getting matured by people like Colbert, by people like Carey, and so forth. And while yes, there are like authoritarian implementations of that, like the Soviet Union, again, the core insight that I'm trying to like not let rightoidism scare me away from the Soviet Union is that why did the Soviet Union produce goods? And it is because it employed state development logic and insights to their statecraft to do that. Just as more benign examples exist that you could say in other parts of the world with like a South Korea or a Taiwan or a post-war Japan or so forth and so forth. But again, you could also see that in the development of European and American states and how they came to be more developed. But we have a rose-tinted glass of viewing that as like, well, they were less authoritarian than the Soviet Union and China and all these other places.
Right,
But it's
right.
like they were the purveyors of imperialism. And so they did that
Yeah,
while at
yeah.
the
I
same
don't.
time
Yeah.
doing all these terrible things. And everybody on the left can make great observations of these terrible things. But nonetheless, like we're interested in not the peripheral baggage of like the failings of humanity, but looking at like what is the progressive force that is actually driving the ability to create a more progressive society. And that's where I locate it like in this other tradition that has these things like MMT baked into it, how MMT can like extract you away from the necessity of global financial capital. Because again, when we talked about your example, it was venture capital, seed checks, Series A checks to start a company with a couple units of labor and a couple laptops. Like again, that is something that can be satisfied by a state bank. If you get into more higher level stuff of
Yeah,
industrialization, it's harder.
there's like a problem you run into that with, but we are in agreement, it seems, that even if the state can tackle like capital inequality, capital mobility on the
Sure,
national level, it can do development at the national level. And that I absolutely agree.
sure,
I wouldn't say though that like Korea and China are really good examples of MMT because if anything, they underuse their own state capacity, I would argue. It might seem like they use their state capacity because they're just more like autocratic regimes, but in terms of like what they deliver at the level of healthcare and the welfare, I mean, like China has actually less socialized medicine than the UK has, and in terms of like welfare benefits or like social safety net, it's like far less than like Canada or Britain, right? It's or in some cases you could argue like less than some states in the United States too. I mean, it's
sure,
very like in some ways they part of their whole strategy is keeping the workforce as competitive as possible by like they took away like the iron rice bowl program, for instance. That was like this big one of the big like social benefits, socialist policies under Mao. They like Deng Xiaoping ended that, right? But in terms of the goals of like using state-led development, I from the MMT lens, very much agree there's a lot to be done. I think Bill Mitchell's book, Reclaiming the State, is really good on this.
mm-hmm.
I'm not a person who's like, an anarchist, like anti-statist completely. Like, I think the state has a big role to play. Um,
Yeah,
when it comes to what it can do, there certainly is a lot. And I mean, in terms of successful examples of MMT, what's kind of funny is like, I mean, yes, there's like America. You could use cases of Roosevelt America. You could use cases of, you know, I mean, like there's various cases, but it's not like it's debatable because it might be associated by regimes that are quite negative. So it's like the Soviet Union, for instance. That's why I said, like, are you talking about a Soviet economy? The paradox of the Soviet economy, or even like the economy of India to some extent prior to,
Yeah,
like, the 1980s, is that they were able to like virtually fund whatever for a lot of things through the state. But the issue with funding corporations is you run into like this efficiency problem where firms know that they're going to receive funding from the state unless they become very inefficient. And this was like a very real issue with those kind of economies, and the communist economies, and even ones who had elements of it, like the Indian economy.
sure.
Now, there's also like other examples of state-led development, which is like, this is a controversial example, but like fascist Italy and Germany. Obviously, what they did with the war machine was horrible, and like, what they did with, trying to spend that money. But like anyone knows like the Nazi Germany, like in the early years, was kind of like an economic miracle in terms of like the fact that it just was able to. How did they fund things? They just like they just like created money to develop stuff. The the fascists and communists, one thing they kind of understood is that, like, okay, if we want to do stuff, what really matters is, do we have the people to do it, and do we have like the resources, the money? Who gives a fuck? They didn't
Mhm.
care at all about that. So like that's one thing that they did get right. For the goals is a whole other story. But this brings me to a kind of question, which is, and it's a tendency that some people are angsty about MMT because, and I think it is relevant to the actually fascist and communist examples, is corporatism.
Mm.
Because if the state is, allocating, uh, you know, is essentially responsible for this development, there is a central issue at play, which is, there still is like conflict between capital and labor, right? When it comes to how much labor will demand relative to capital. And you can get into like inflationary spirals potentially. I mean, this did happen
Mhm.
actually in the 70s in some of the Scandinavian countries, in
Mhm.
Sweden in particular. And the state, and the corporatist model is there to reconcile the differences. And usually what it does, it ends up subordinating the workers, and it ends up subordinating the, uh, you know, power of independent labor to the state, and then that has all the problems that you would expect. And by the way, the communists did this too. That's why I find the communism kind of a ironic sort of development, because communism did in many ways what the fascists admitted that they wanted to do, which is we wanted to put like labor and capital under like the state umbrella. But the communists, they said that it was the workers' state, but they did the same thing, you
Mhm.
know. um what, in what sense is like the economic model that you were developed? Because I'm not familiar with like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Carey's ideas, so it's like I'm not like, what, in what way would it differ from corporatism? Because my critique of corporatism is that corporatism, especially if you don't have a democratic state, can very much lead to like a sort of autocracy where the state just uses these like ways of managing labor and capital to like whatever ends of the party in power.
Yeah. So, and again, I apologize if I keep bringing up sort of a source which you're not familiar with, but I do view it as, because it's my personal project, and because I see it as so embedded, like it does have concrete embedding in intellectual history, that a lot of people don't realize, like how influential these thinkers were and their writings were. But with that disclaimer being said, um, what we keep kind of going back to, I see, is like a problem of forms versus substance. Um, so it's like, okay, we have instantiations, we have a form of a state, of a system of governments, of a collection of ideas running a particular society. And that form can have problems that we can all analyze and critique. But I keep, as I said, I keep trying to get to the substance. And again, this mission was started because I was finding the right wing's descriptions of the Soviet Union totally insufficient. Because I said, like, yeah, I get it. You can keep telling me these like scary stories about Soviet Union, but like again, like you're not explaining to me your mythology of the Soviet Union should say that in 1918 it collapses to zero, but history proves that the opposite. So it's like, what was it about the Soviet Union from 1917 forward that allowed it to create an industrial powerhouse? And so it was that, let's do away with the peripheral aesthetic of form and get to the substance of why that occurred. And again, that's where I find the substance. And when I talk about Careyism, or again, this sort of more perennial, universal other tradition, is I'm talking about this substance of like, how does progress happen? How does the state's role have a feedback loop with individual reason? So you have scientists inventing things that begets technological transformation and so forth, but you also have the state coming in and doing things like universal public education, which creates a rise in the sophistication of the populace that creates those scientists in the first place. And further, the development of things like the Erie Canal, which was an entirely state-led development project, which is like, I think, viewed way too redundantly as just like they dug a hole. But like the American state was such of a force in doing that, and that Erie Canal was such of a boon for like uplifting people, and actualizing those individual traits that would keep begetting, again, this progressive spiral effect. So that is the substance of what I'm talking about, and I don't think that then like a form of corporatism is necessarily like, oh, it like then equates in like the essentialism of that form. Again, I'm thinking of like, we have these concepts of how we use human institutions and the relationship between the individual and the kind of aggregate state as a centralized power, but nonetheless, a collective. And it's that tension, and it's that figuring out the reason, like, what is the best application of that? Is what I'm talking about. And maybe that's a cop out that people could criticize me of saying like I'm being too abstract with my notions. But I think when you observe many different points in the world and you view those points through history, you do start to see this universal and perennial trend of this substance taking place. Because again, this is not so much, as I described earlier, like the singularity of Marxism sometimes I view as like a problem, in that like only through the study of Marxism can you arrive out the other side of knowing like how to transform society for a progressive good. I think it's much more of like, there are ideas out there which are, Platonic in the sense, and that many people are converging on these existent ideas as they're developing through history. And sometimes there's direct influence between individuals, but sometimes there's just people discovering these ideas on themselves. And so that's where it's like, you look at somebody like Sun Yat-sen, who's the forefather of both traditions of revolutionary Chinese politics, both revered in Taiwan and mainland China. And he is very much like kind of a Careyist in how he positions himself. He's probably, his greatest influence was maybe Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things, again, I'm talking about this embeddedness of Carey, which requires me to keep talking about him, is that Carey was like Lincoln's top economic advisor. And so to the degree that Sun Yat-sen was talking about political economy through the lens of Lincoln, he was talking about it through the lens of the Republican Party, which was very much based on the economic theories of Henry C. Carey. And so when you look about what then Sun Yat-sen's writing, as much as there is an influence there, he is bringing indigenous observations from his own period, from indigenous sources within the Chinese tradition. And thus we have a synthesis of like the convergence of indigenous intellectual thought meeting sort of the conversation of kind of a global intellectual sphere. And so it's like long-winded way of explaining this. But again, I think this speaks to, there is a substance that occurs in various forms throughout the world, throughout history, of arriving at just like the ideas that are correct of how to do this thing. And that is what we should be trying to crystallize and trying to evolve and trying to do, rather than, again, trying to like retroactively, like through deductive reasoning, like, okay, so some guy, whether it's Marx or some other thinker, said this, and we have to keep rationalizing why that was correct through the process of like correcting Marxism. And so that's where I view like the whole thing of, Marxist Leninism and like all the sort of thinking that comes after that as like, oh, well, we're correcting Marxism. And it's like, I view that as like, you're kind of refuting Marxism by like kind of having to reverse engineer these ideas that are in substance the same as Carey. Even if you're not reading Carey, you're converging on them because these are Platonic notions that you eventually discover. So that is really my point. And to the degree that that can be misused and oppress labor, oppress the working class, oppress other people. The Soviet Union certainly oppressed intellectuals, a different band of intellectuals that were in competition with the Bolsheviks and weren't too friendly to them. Um, the oppression is something to be corrected. The oppression, again, it's in a sort of like convergent way and parallel way to what Marx would say. It's like the development of the bourgeoisie revolutions into the proletariat revolutions. It's like the bourgeoisie revolution was good in the sense that for its time in history, like it was good. But we should build off that and take in the good things of that and then have the proletariat revolution. I wouldn't go about the sort of mechanics of the way Marx would say that, but I would put it in my vocabulary of like, we need to keep improving the substance of democracy. Like, it's good that, from the monarchs and the feudal aristocrats, that bourgeoisie property owners and perhaps capitalists like took power back and created a relatively more democratic system. But we just have to keep improving the way in which that democratic system can speak for the voice of the people. And then you will keep compounding and creating a better state, a better society that can do that. And in a sense, if you read Sun Yat-sen, which I think is actually pretty cool for you to do with your project, you can actually see that he is critiquing the West in not exactly their political economy, but their process of democracy. Because he's critiquing like parliamentarism, he's critiquing the sort of the developmental stage between feudalism and sort of like capitalist bourgeoisie. And he's trying to figure out like, it's like, okay, yeah, something happened in the West that didn't happen over here that led to sort of progression of society, that led to this industrial revolution. There's something about that we should sort of appreciate. At the same time, he's like, at the same time, a lot of this stuff gets corrupted. There's a lot of problems with it. And so we have to figure out from square one, how do we do democracy, but not have it be corrupted into what we're starting to see in the West, where I would probably say, from what I know about your book, you'd find a lot of resonance in what Sun Yat-sen was saying about democracy of the West with how you're describing democracy in your book. That's my guess.
Sure. I'm not sure about that specific Sun Yat-sen that you're writing about. I'm well aware of Sun Yat-sen as a revolutionary, and his mythology and the way he's used by the KMT and the communists. But yeah, no, we could get into my book, but that's a whole other big topic. Maybe when it comes out, because that will bring us in a different direction. I am surprised if there's. So, is there anything else you wanted to get into? Because I didn't expect to get into so much economics.
Yeah, no, I wanted to have a conversation with you to sort of flesh some of my thinking out because I'm trying to work through my ideas here, and I appreciate the knowledge you have of the left and of Marxism. And so I'm trying to make sure that if I have a problem in my logic, that you're correcting me and you're putting my ideas in the wood chipper if they are bad. So yeah, so that was the goal of my conversation here. Is there something in particular?
I need to read Carey because that's not really in my
Yeah,
wheelhouse.
I'll send you some stuff. Like definitely the Reinhardt. I think the Reinhardt book's probably the best introduction to this idea. And but actually, like Keynes, like you've read Keynes, like you said, right? Yeah. So once you kind of have the mental model of Keynes, like you'll start to see like all this stuff that Keynes was kind of getting. In a way, Keynes was kind of, sometimes I see him as like he's kind of self-contained in certain respects. But you can see the flowering from Keynes into then what Reinhardt's saying, and then into this whole idea of like the other tradition. And as I say, like it's more of this perennial and universal conception of a substance of, how do you progress society versus like a strict doctrine.
You use this word a lot, perennial, and
Yeah,
I've not heard that word used in the economic context a lot.
yeah,
But that sounds interesting because for me, I am interested in like perennial philosophy at the level of tradition.
yeah,
So sometimes I say like my view on morality is somewhat perennialist in the sense, but I use the word perennialist just because the word traditionalism has a kind of baggage due to some far right thinkers.
yeah.
But like in the sense, so I'm a Christian. I in a very genuine way believe Christianity's better than other religions. But I do think various religions and traditions across cultures get at some universal truths,
Mhm,
and that those universal truths and traditions are very important. And that I tend to point to that as almost like a basis of truth of certain traditions, um, as a bulwark against kind of relativism and the kind of the relativism that I would say powers a lot of progressive transhumanism, and the kind of undermining of a lot of human society. Let's just put it that way. Um,
mhm.
but yeah, like I never thought of that actually at the sense of like perennial economic ideas. Like, what is the best way to like?
Yeah, I mean, it just gets to like what I was saying. Like I'm kind of viewing perennialism in the economic sphere as like this tension between oligarchy and democracy. And of course, like this vocabulary comes out of ancient Greece. And to whatever degree, how different when we take away the difference of technology and institutions and just sort of these achievements of civilization through time, when we try to like kind of take away those um, aesthetics, as I'm using them, is using that word very carefully. Like again, I don't see that economic relationship that much different in substance. You have like if there was more democracy in ancient Greece, that would be a better situation uh, relative to its technology and institutional level than if there was more oligarchy. And so the same way today, like in substance, if there was more democracy with all of these new things that we have in technology and societal structures and institutions, that would just be better. And I think as an impulse and as an intuition, that is shared with a lot of like socialist thinkers. Um, and so that's where like the perennial nature of it like keeps coming back to like when we read history, like we find all these echoes and we find all these similarities. And like you said about capitalism, like it has this incentive structure to keep expanding and expanding, expanding. Well, like why was that different than the Roman Empire? Like, I mean, what else is the Roman Empire but this internal logic of expansion? And it's like the depletion of
No, I'd say it's very
units.
different
Well, like when let me just
for a
define
very
it.
simple reason, actually.
Yeah, you can critique me. So I'll do this definition. The Roman Empire, in that sense, is the depletion of units of labor, units of land in a given territory. So it then, to keep increasing its power and wealth, it has to keep expanding into peripheral territories. Now, could it go global? Probably not at the technological sophistication of that age, but the substance of that, I think, is still like the case. They deplete the land and the labor, and so they have to keep finding new units of labor. They have to keep finding new parcels of land to keep doing so. And so, yeah, that's just the nature of oligarchy versus any particular form of
I think
oligarchy.
that's very different because that's the nature of oligarchy in the sense that's the nature of power, and that there's a tendency of when one acquires power, there's a drive to expand it. That's why the Roman Empire starts with Caesar's permanent dictatorship that was supposed to be temporary, right? As soon as you get the permanent dictatorship, you lay the foundations for expansion. That's why every like dictator is more likely to go to war with countries. Like
Sure.
this is statistically true because when one possesses absolute power, they seek power elsewhere. It's also, when you have a military regime as opposed to a democratic regime, the way in which you legitimize yourself to the military people is that you need to deliver benefits to them. So the military people will invade countries, and they'll reap most of the rewards. So there's that level of like expansion, which is far older. But capitalist expansion is like is more widespread total, but also, and this is not in a negative sense. In some sense, it's more democratic too, because capitalism is always displacing elites. That's kind of the difference. Is like, there's power always expands, but in the case of capital, the power of all the capitalists is not stable whatsoever. Like the same richest people now won't be the same richest people necessarily in 50 years, right? Like
Sure.
there's always totally like it's shifting. Like most of these capitalists don't even have access to like a great majority of their wealth, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, in some sense, it's a more democratic system and it's always shifting. That's why I think elite theory is so important in the capitalist world too, because it's like there's all these rival capitalists. They're always rivaling each other, right? And like,
Yeah. But why is the
it's why like the
trans?
free marketeers, the ANCAPs, which I know you're familiar with that world, like
Yeah.
they do have one big point in that like less regulated capitalism in some sense is more democratic. It can be because like if you have what you have in like a lot of this is why like state-led development in my opinion only works if you either have like the perfect benevolent dictatorship, which is rare, or you have a somewhat democratic state, because it's we forget all the failed examples. We only remember like the good examples. There's all these
Mhm.
examples like Peronism, where you have like, or
Yeah.
like all like the regimes in the Middle East or South America of like these dictatorial sort of like autocratic regimes where the state based, or like just Putin today, right?
Mhm.
Like what they basically do is they just enrich a particular section of the capitalist class, which is like tied to the state and at the expense of the other people. Whereas like the more democratic capitalist state that allows for more competition between capitalists will actually be better and more prosperous. So that's like where even people like also, Hayek have a
What
kind
is
of point
yeah
about the
what
democratic aspect of capitalism, or like that like markets in some sense, or Schumpeter's,
yeah
like whole fucking thing of the what is it called, the transformation or whatever it's called. What I'm
yeah
saying.
I mean that's where like it's ironic because like I'm looking at like America, Britain, like Anglo Atlanticism, like there's so much rosy tinting to that. Whereas, like, is it really free markets? Is dollar diplomacy really free markets? Like, is the covert, subterfuge that goes on, like that we are not allowed to talk about in like polite academic circles, like, is that really free market or is that like a form of imperialism? So that's where it's like, yeah, I can have critiques of both and I can see the merits of both. Uh, but I think this goes back to like why do we have to view forms as static when we should be viewing them as um, not always moving, always becoming.
Yeah, no, that I can totally agree with. Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to sort of suggest here, and like getting back to the perennialism is that like while these things have in substance sort of manifested themselves as tension, and people have tried to correct that. Like again, when we think about the inflection points of history, like we can think about them being imperfect, but they're in a state of becoming. And so it's like, was Constantine formalizing the church a progressive inflection point in civilization? Many people would say, just at a surface level, no, because of all the obvious critiques we could make. But did this set off a chain reaction to create things like monasteries that are the predecessors of the modern university system? And so forth, of all the things we can kind of go in with that. Not to say these things are perfect in and of themselves, but they are becoming, and thus they are the progressive drive in history. And so that's where I'm trying to use perennialism as that sense of we're finding the substance of this insight throughout history. And as we go through time, we're actually perfecting it. We're finding better versions of it. Colbert does a better version of it. Um, you know,
Yeah.
Carey and List do a better version of
Very
it, so forth and so
Hegelian.
forth. Yeah, and so this is where there's an interesting relationship between Hegel and Carey and between Hegel and these thinkers. I mean, when we talk about Friedrich List, he is in Germany and he's sort of in the conversation of
Yeah.
the Hegelians. And then he goes to America and is hanging out with the Careys in Philadelphia. And so there's a conversation going on, which is very interesting in that regard, that creates this other system of thought, that again, I don't think they themselves would necessarily describe it um, as so doctrinaire. Whereas, like, that's why it's so hard to kind of put like a system of thought box around this stuff. And it's so hard to find the archetype of this stuff. And this was my motivation for my book project, because it's like when we think about capitalism, we have a cartoon figure of Adam Smith that pops up. When we think about socialism, we have the cartoon figure of Karl Marx that pops up. And then we can kind of find their disciples in the pantheon of those schools of thought. But that you don't have that for the school of thought that, I'm kind of using Careyism as a short of hand, but people are more familiar actually with Friedrich List and his book, The National System of Political Economy. And so often that term is then called it's nationalism. And so right there we have already kind of like an amorphous amoeba of a system of thought, which is kind of hard to define. And even pinning that on one man like Friedrich List is like kind of hard to do, because Friedrich List in his own time was not as like read as much as like the works of Carey. And so that's the irony of like the Bismarckian state in Germany, is that when you look into the intellectual history of that, and there's a good book by Eric Heinlein called The Neo-Mercantilist that does that. He's been on the podcast, by the way. And he traces like, oh, the books that were being read by the people around Bismarck were actually Carey's books, because the German historical school was participating with American universities in this conversation. And so naturally, like his books were much more a source of inspiration than actually List was. And it's only because like, I mean, List had good ideas. And again, he had his place in the pantheon. But like the irony is that the kind of chauvinism of a natural like native land would have is they want the German figurehead to be of like this system of thought versus like this Irish Catholic guy, or kind of that was hanging out in Philadelphia. Even though the intellectual history shows a guy like Carey was more influential. So that's what I'm trying to say, that these ideas of like a progressive state, even like the social question, social democracy, there is a bigger, wider conversation, especially going on in the 19th century and before that, than just like having to always go through the singularity of Marxism and then coming out and even going, well, we're going to start correcting Marxism through Leninism and so forth. And even when we go into like, oh, Lenin corrected this aspect of Marx, Lenin is talking about in his tract on anti-imperialism that he is taking these things from J.A. Hobson. So it's like Hobson then is a bridge to this other conversation that I'm speaking of about this sort of implicit and explicit sort of Careyism or Friedrich Listism, or again, these people that would be called bourgeois by Orthodox Marxists. So that's where, like, why do we have to take refutation as a correction versus like of Marx and Marxist thinkers have their place in intellectual tradition as Reinhardt in his lineage places them. But the problem is the centrism. The problem is the singularity of it that is taking away from the universality of all these other thinkers and the perennialism of what they're kind of engaging in their project. So I hope that clarifies what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to get to, because there's a lot of economics. Like I said, I love economics. Just hasn't made me want to revisit a bunch of things. Because
Yeah.
I go through arcs right now. A lot of it, well, first of all, I'm trying to finish my book, but
Yeah.
then there's a lot of it is like history related. History and a lot of culture actually. So I would say like cultural historians have been what I've been looking at a lot recently, like Christopher Lash,
Mhm.
EJ Dion. Maybe I'll go back on my economics arc, because I've been wanting to get deeper into capital as power.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
again, like I'm talking about political economy, but at the same time, like there's like this root in kind of a Hegelian way of thinking, and so we're kind of getting even beyond um, just the numbers and cents and materialism of economics, and like again, like what is history? because like history is a facet of economics and like how you develop. So that's very important. By the way, I meant to mention this too. We probably can sync up. I'm sure you read Ha-Joon Chang.
Yeah, I've read Ha-Joon Chang, the
Yeah,
23 Problems of Capitalism, and then the Bad Samaritans
yeah,
kicking down the ladder.
yeah. So Chang's whole point, I don't know if you
Yeah,
appreciate him or not.
Keynesian. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I think he's like approaching what I'm saying. Like he's getting at this idea that is like, I don't know if he doesn't call himself a Marxist. He's like, I want to take
Yeah,
bits from
sound like
everything.
the neo-Keynesians. Yeah, like he's a neo-Keynesian kind of. So
Yeah.
is like Maria Mazzucato,
Yeah.
the
Um,
entrepreneurial state. Yeah, like I
fun
remember I
fact,
ended up, huh?
fun fact about
Yeah.
Mazzucato, which is what like the embeddedness of what I'm saying. I love discussing this. Mazzucato started her think tank at UCL. Um, and in the opening ceremony, she invited Ericus Reinhardt and said, I'm going to paraphrase, but like the vibe of Reinhardt's work pervades her think tank at UCL. And so this is why it's so important to think about more popular speakers that are getting at like very interesting insights and how this is connecting back to these embedded conceptions of people like Reinhardt. And what Reinhardt's talking about was which I'm talking about is the embeddedness of like a guy like Carey, even though he might prioritize Friedrich List, which is, as I was getting at with Chang, kicking away the ladder for Chang is the biggest apology for Frederick Listism. So it's like people tend to just gravitate to List for whatever reason. And the entire point of kicking away the ladder is to say Friedrich List is this very unknown thinker in the 19th century, but he is very influential, and his ideas actually have more merit in how history has proven certain concepts correct, such as industrial development, so forth, state-led development, and how these things are actually embedded, whether people talk about them explicitly or not, in things like how England engaged in the initial industrial development, because they engaged in these policies, even though we wouldn't, like, it just feels like weird to say that about that time period of England.
Yeah, that's in the Bad Samaritans, you know,
Sure.
the whole thing about how
Yeah.
the
Kicking,
countries will be engaged in state-led development while they're developing, and then once they're in a hegemonic position, they'll be pro free trade and lowering the barriers because they're in a position to reap those rewards. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And then this gets into that conversation gets into then of course you have free trade, but free trade is sort of thus getting into kind of a study of imperialism because free trade kind of comes along with imperialism. Because like free trade is what just kicking down the doors that
Some
England
would
wants
say
to
the
do.
opposite. Some would say the opposite.
Why
You can argue.
would
It depends on what you mean. Do you mean like financial imperialism, or do you mean like imperialism as in a war? Because some would say, like Hayek, for example, make the compelling case that it's actually precisely the kind of you know closing inward, from trading that is more likely to lead to military competition replacing the financial competition. And then like it goes back to
yeah.
Kant, right? Kant thinking that there'll be perpetual peace if like you actually have more trade like between countries. And
Yeah, well, again, like that's the conversation of like World War One should never happen because everybody was increasing trade between them up to World War One, and then it happened. So,
well, yes and no.
well, I mean, it's a debate, but
Yeah.
like the kind of broad stroke is like everyone was thinking at the turn of the 20th century, like, look, everyone's free trading, everyone's becoming more interdependent in a global system of trade. We'll never go to war again, and then World War One happens. And again, is this because of mechanics of like how things happen, or is this because of like a more Hegelian concept of Geist? Is like there's Geist in the world and there's sort of anti-Geist. There's sort of reason of like you do the wrong thing or the right thing, and there's individual actors that do that, so forth. So I think that gets into a conversation of then like how do you view history? How do you view change? How do you view the concept of ideas? Which is very cultural. It's very philosophical.
If
But
you have read Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, like
yeah,
the full book.
which I generally like have more of an appreciation of than I think, again, the surface level conversation about it. And I
Yeah,
generally view him as like not an on a personal level, he says he likes like the neoliberal system or whatever, like the end, he likes the end of history on a personal level.
more
But at it,
critical of it now, but yeah, yeah.
yeah, but at an academic, what he's saying as an academic in the end of history is like he's saying, okay, look, I'm a guy. I'm around other thinkers and the propaganda of America. The propaganda of America and what these intellectuals of Americans propaganda say is that, you know, here's all the tenets of liberalism and democracy and so forth, and our, you know, binary fight with the forces of communism and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, communism as a stand-in for barbarism. And there's a perennialism to that. Like, you know, communism can just be perceived as all these bad forms of government that have come,
That's
tyranny, tyrants. But to finish that, what Fukuyama is more so saying, he's not saying I like this or I advocate this. He's saying the America propaganda says this is what the tenets are. And if I play the logical conclusion at this is where we arrive. And he's starting to get at a critique of, you know, that logic of the propaganda, which is why he's coming up with things of like mega Thymia will keep sort of
megalithymia.
will
Yeah.
keep resurrecting a
Well, I brought him
challenge
up
to
more
this.
because of that, honestly. Like not because of the
Mhm.
whole really end of history thing, the idea of the end of history itself. It's more the way he looks at the way history happened in this very Hegelian way. He's extremely Hegelian, and he just thinks Marx was wrong about what that trajectory would be, but he takes the same view kind of how
Yeah,
history functions, and it's very materialist. That's the thing why I brought Fukuyama's
yeah.
End of History is extremely economic book,
Mhm.
like, and it goes into like a lot of examples of failed state-led development, right?
Mhm.
Like because there's a lot of successful state-led development and many failed versions, right? So it's like it's not really even that dichotomy that matters so much. Like, you know, that's why there's all these interesting things about like why the Soviet economies failed and why these sort of like import substitution models of development failed with many Latin American countries. Because like we forget that like, you know, there's Latin American economies had these neoliberal systems that were failing, and that's what led to the pink tide to try to like go beyond that, right? But people forget that before the neoliberal turns, there was also this whole big period of like state-led import substitution that like Argentina, Brazil, various of those economies were engaging in that actually was not very particularly successful. It was extremely corrupt. It was, you know, and some call it even mercantilist,
Yeah,
right?
but this is where I would just like conjecture, like the leftist writers of, you know, American imperialism in South America are correct. Like America inserted itself into those processes. And you can certainly lay blame at the efficacy of a leader or a government to implement successful state-led development. But I do think it's not enough just to say that. You have to include the fact like America was putting its boot on the Western Hemisphere for reasons of its own geopolitical interests, that it did not want like a challenger in its backyard. And so, like, how can we talk about these things without talking about all the covert operations, um, and all the ways that America stymied South
That's
America?
more the neoliberal period. But the reason for the failure of the before the neoliberal period is more
America was invading Mexico. I mean, like, you know, America, well, first of all, in the 19th century, America literally stole Mexico. So, like, you know, I don't view this as like a limitation of the 1970s or something. Like, America's been doing this since before the US Civil War. And the conquest of the Mexican territory of Western continental 48 America is in a way like a precursor to what would then incentivize the Civil War, because it
I'm
was
not
the
sure. I'm not sure what that's to really do with it. I'm more just talking like I'm talking simply about like Peronism.
yeah,
Yeah,
but I'm saying like you're saying America
there's a lot of that, by
subversion
the way. Like,
occurs in the 1970s forward, maybe the 1960s. That's what you're
oh, it's
saying.
earlier than that. I mean, it's not even about. That's not my point. I'm like I don't. It's not really what I care to debate. It's like
Yeah, I'm
my
not
point
trying to be
about
aggressive, by the way.
my
I'm
my
just
point about state-led development is merely that. the not all state development is created equal. Not all state-led development is better than the market development. Like it's a matter of like what are you using the state for and how,
Mhm.
because there's all these limits. And in some sense, this might surprise some of my listeners because I lean quite left economically, but you know, really Hayek never stopped being relevant. Like Hayek's extremely relevant when it comes to the inefficiencies of planning.
Mhm.
So much so that he's, I think, relevant not just to inefficiencies of planning at the level of government and like socialism, but at the kind of markets that exist today. Like a lot of the most sophisticated online markets now, digitalized markets, are like planned markets. If you look at the way the YouTube algorithm works, it's an example of a kind of planned market. It's
Sure.
a market in the sense of supply. It's trying to supply, like viewers with stuff it'll think they find entertaining, right? But it actually does so very imperfectly, and it plans in a way that segments people into categories. And the example of like this, imperfect process is like precisely how the economy these algorithms will like get a very narrow idea of what someone is as an individual,
Mhm.
and they'll like recommend them stuff based on what they've watched a few times, and it won't really be perfect. They'll also like give people the wrong viewers. I find the market and it's like a planned market. That's the kind of thing about it. It's like the algorithm is deliberately designed to segment people into specific categories. It's like a very new kind of system, but it's based on, it shows you the inadequacy of information, and that's a big contribution of Hayek. Is like the information problem is really really key, and you can't like overcome it just with more data. Like still, the algorithm usually takes a year and a half or longer to figure out who to recommend my main channel's videos from. Like my videos don't blow up usually until like a year or a year and a half or longer till they're out, because it's like suddenly the algorithm just figures out, oh, this is the people who should be like watching this, who will like this. But for a while, it has no idea. It's like, oh, I recommended it to leftists. Why aren't leftists checking it out? Well, it's like, I
Mhm.
didn't make it for leftists. Dumb, dumb, figure it out. But anyway, I just bring that up to like, if a state was to plan things, it would run
Mhm.
into these same kind of problems in even worse ways. And
Sure.
like when it comes to like, and I know I've been around a lot of communists that used to also believe this idea that, oh, well, because we have more data, you can like plan the economy. Well, not really. It's like there's
Yeah.
still there's society is complex in such a way, and like a lot of the biggest failures result in trying to like manage very complex systems in some sense. Like like seeing like a state by John C. Scott.
No.
It's kind of like left wing Hayek
Okay.
in some sense. Like, and he's understanding like the failure of like attempts to do that. So it's like for me, the use of the state is one like making decisions, legitimate decisions, enforcing those decisions, restoring order, and the money printer. That's
Sure.
where the state is useful. When it comes to managing things, I think state is very inadequate to society, which is why I tend to be far more like a proponent of the worker cooperatives as opposed to like nationalization. I'm very
Mhm.
critical of nationalizing industries. Like I
Yeah.
don't think in a lot of cases that actually does very much like to improve things, you know.
Yeah. I I mean that's where it's a it's not a static uh
This is not really a
statecraft.
point against you.
Yeah.
This is a,
Yeah, which
if anything, is
I totally,
complimentary point.
yeah, because I totally agree with you in a dynamic sense that like in a given instance or at a given time, nationalization might not be great. But I think like more times than not, like I much rather have nationalization of the financial sector if I had to make that trade and like willy nilly do whatever you want in like the industrial sector or the commercial sector. Um, I'll make that trade because like I view there is an identity to like finance that is not shared in that of like traditional industry or then like kind of the lower order, restaurants and like that type of business. Because money is like so important because money has this, MMT like quality to it that no other type of thing shares. And so there's a degree to which like the state really needs to have some mechanism of control over that. And that's where like nationalization is not like as complete a word to describe like what is needed in that regard. There are guys that have talked about um, how central bank window guidance works in terms of guiding the private banking through credit quotas and things like that, rather than telling banks this is the investment you need to make to this business by this amount. It's much more setting big goals, setting big aggregates, and then trying to synthesize that with the allowances of sort of entrepreneurship and sort of market mechanisms um, to do its thing, to do the good thing that it does. And so that's where it's like, it gets back. It's like state-led development. It could fail. It could do the wrong thing. There could be a stupid guy doing it. And like, that's all, totally valid. But that's where it's like, I don't think it's necessary to like leave the conversation in that static place when we're talking about, well, why didn't they work? Like, why, what did it go wrong? And it's like, well, it's this problem because they made this bad policy, or
Yeah.
because America stuck its fat head into the situation and did an imperialism.
Ma-
So, yeah,
Maybe if this audience might be a little confused about like this, to maybe make this a little like practical,
sure.
tangible. So like I think a lot of the points I brought up, what it is to say is that, so like I am, socialist insofar as I believe that socialism is a distribution of economic power and that democracy is a distribution of political power. So I just see socialism insofar as it means anything good, because if it just means government control, I don't want it. I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
socialist in that case. I view it as like, distribution of economic power, democracy in the economy. Now, can you have total version of that? No, but I think it's important. But I view myself as like more limitarian, in the essay you read, limitarian as opposed to libertarian, because to me, like I don't believe like I don't think we figured out something better than the market system. And it's when it comes to the production of goods and services, I just don't really see how the market system is better. I think we can limit where we allow the market to go, where market is
Mm-hmm.
clearly not good. I don't think market is great in a lot of things that have particularly inelastic demand.
Mm-hmm.
So things that people always need, the market's naturally bad at, and you have like kind of monopolistic sort of control by nature due to that, and like price gouging due to the fact that if people demand something all the time, markets just aren't really great. But when it comes to fluctuating demand, just like you just can't be like we just planning just fails to beat markets every time when it comes to fluctuating demands and stuff that people
Mm-hmm.
don't really need but want, like nice things. Markets are just like better. Um, I've yet to see like how the like supercomputers or whatever are gonna like change this. I don't
Yeah.
really think so. And the other thing, like, so I'm for not having though the marketization of all aspects of life. Like some things should be decommodified. I think we decommodify relationships, for example. Like I think social liberalism, and that's why I'm a social conservative to some extent. Social liberalism has the indirect effect that a lot of people overlook, that it actually allows for market relations to
Mm-hmm.
supersede traditional relations, and the market relations can be far worse in the case of a lot of like things that people complain about, like the way in which dating has become very transactional and commodified and aspects like that, or
Mm-hmm.
family life as a whole. I mean, Marx was already writing about that back then, to some extent, even though it's far less uh, widespread as compared to now. And the other aspect is like this is where the libertarian comes in. It's distributing the excesses. So I think like the problem with market systems is they create excess, which is like excessive inequality, and they have a Pareto principle. Like there's like winners and losers, and I think there's a social obligation in some sense we should have to like equalize the differences in inequality. But that's why it limit. Like you have a no, like in the sense that democracy's purpose, like the people don't rule in representative democracy. It's not actually like Greek democracy. That is like a
Yeah.
very difficult system to achieve at a large scale. But the virtue of democracy, it's why Churchill called it the least bad system, is like no one can be like too powerful, like a Führer. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think in the sense that like you shouldn't have like CEO monarchs, you shouldn't have like ultra wealthy people in gated communities, in like people on the streets, or people who work should have a dignified life. Like that's sort of my worldview. But when it comes to like replacing the like the market system with like a state planning system, I'm very skeptical of that. And not only do I think that's not necessarily better, but it also leads to its own kind of inequalities, whereby like the new state, the new elite is just like more in enmeshed in the state,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's necessarily better. Like, that's why like the corporatist experiments, I think, and the communist experiments converge on this sort of tendency of like a bureaucratic elite. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So this is where I'll say one, we can go back to your elite theory, which you subscribe to, which sorry, I had a cough. Which I think like neo-reactionaries on the alt-right like take elite theory to just like justify feudal relationships and meritless aristocracy.
Which is strange because it's like that's the opposite of what James Burnham's whole point is in the
Yeah.
book where he like summarized elite theory, the Machiavellians. Because like his whole point is you want democracy not because people are good by nature, but because people are bad. So because of elite theory, you want a rotation of elites that's peaceful.
Yeah, so I think the essence of what elite theory is getting at is like you can't get away from kind of a hierarchical institution, in that there will always be an elite um, that will run society. And so it's about, well, how do you create a process to, as you say, change those elites? How do you create those elites in the first place? Like, how do you educate them? What do you educate them on? Which stories do you tell them? And like, again, we're kind of getting back into Plato's Republic. And so like the essentialism that elites manifest, because that's what happens, not because of inequality necessarily, or because of blood, hereditariness, or all these other bad things. It's just simply the fact that some, like just to the simple level, some people are more educated than others. And so that's where, when we think of the term like intellectuals, like it's not just like somebody in a swivel chair that like works on a MacBook. That's not exactly what we mean by intellectuals, or some 19th century like limp-wristed poet. Like that's not the essence of what intellectual means in this sense. It's just like a king can be an intellectual. Necessarily, they probably have to be intellectuals because they were only one that could probably read Latin at the time, compared to everybody else. So the capacity to have knowledge and to have wisdom makes someone an intellectual, which can come from any class background. If they have the predicates of things like leisure time, of resources to get books, of mentors and teachers to become intellectualized. Nowadays, more and more people can become intellectuals by watching channels like yours. And that's how easy it is. So to that degree, it's like, how do we get these intellectuals into power? And again, I think that's the thing that like Carey is getting at, is that we need to get these intellectuals into power so they can be in charge of the state, which he calls the brain of the body. And so
Uh-oh.
again, this is where again, it's not like the sort of authoritarian problem that can be described as that.
That's what
It's
Orwell warns against, actually. It's the whole
well,
point of
Orwell,
Orwell's whole
Orwell
thing.
hated the Irish, so I don't have time for Orwell.
Did he?
But he villainized one of I forget what's the villain in his story. I haven't read that much of Orwell, but I know.
Which one? Which
Is it
are we talking
O'Connor or
Animal
O'Brien?
Farm or in 1984?
1984, isn't one of the villains O'Brien?
Yes.
I have like a thing about I have like a fixation on English like anti-Irish tropes. But but to
He
put
was
that aside,
anti-colonial, by the way, though. Very.
yeah. But let's not get into that debate. But my point is that the brain state is not like a authoritarian description. It is a description of reality. And that like so much of what like the Marxist conversation is like, hey guys, I'm not prescribing something. I am describing something. It is. It is. This is not what we want it to be. It simply is this. And so Carey is doing that. It's like this. The state, in its essence, is not, any other of these sort of things we want it to be. The state is essentially this because it is the monopoly on violence that determines ownership. And again, ownership. Nothing in the market economy or any sort of other sphere of society can can occur without the function of ownership. You can't curtail and limit things without ownership playing into that. And so it's like, again, if the state is embedded in ownership, you can never run away from the state.
No, yeah, I'm not. That's
Yeah.
why I'm not an anarchist. I don't
Yeah,
believe
but
in it.
that's where I would say, like, even I'm not calling you an anarchist or even like a liberal with a night
I
watchman
would say
state.
if anything, I lean to the Republican end, which is
Yeah,
that you have which is different from the idea of like democracy as such. And this is really the idea that, like, you want a limited sort of state. You want, and how limited is not based on what it can necessarily like do in terms of positive, negative liberty. It's based on the fact that, like, there is like a constitution. There's a set of limits on
yeah,
power, and you have like a rotation of parliamentarians, and you also, like, I think you have a mixed government. I believe in a mixed government. I don't think we've figured out the best form of government. I think we should continue to figure that out. Like, but I think it'll probably be a mixed form of government, like where you have one aspect that's highly democratic, perhaps even sortition, one aspect that is very epistocratic, maybe
mm,
like a senate, but that's one that's based on a kind of like expertise. Then you have like a kind of executive. There's been many proposals, and these are all interesting debates. But yeah, like anarchism tries to go away from the state. I find Marxism tries to escape the state, but in doing so creates a totalitarian state, because it believes that you want to abolish the state, or it'll wither away rather. But in the process, they actually suspend the question of state power altogether. And in the transition, they believe that whatever justifies the means of transitioning in the transitional state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it becomes a total state, because if you need it for class conflict, then you can endlessly open the state power. Like, they don't even consider the idea of limiting state power, the Marxists. It's why, like, they end up kind of like rationalizing a totalitarian state. And you see it in the logic not just of the Stalinists, who are more open about it because they defend the experiments, but Trotskyites. Like Trots and like all kind of like people really believe in that idea. If you ask them, they'll say like, "Oh yeah, the Soviet Union, it was too authoritarian, but they had to do it for X, Y. They had to do it for X, Y." Well, if you're like idea of state power is based on like post hoc rationalizations, and it's going to have no limit to it. Whereas, like, if you have a constitution or a mechanism whereby like the people can always discipline the people in power, by booting them out, I think
yeah,
that is, or booting a chamber of it out, that's very important. So for me, like, the state is important, and I do believe in this contradiction. So there's this
yeah,
contradiction in my thinking, which is, um, so I believe in a democratic state, but in some sense, a centralized state for particular matters is actually preferable to a federal system. Like in Canada, our provinces are in charge of most things, and that's not a good thing, because the purse is in the hands of the provinces, and they can't fund things like healthcare and education well. They also can't act on things like climate. They all have different policies. And my old take is actually climate change should be handled by the military. It's my hot take.
I
You know,
like that. I'm looking forward to that essay. Um,
I did a
but
pod on that. But so,
okay,
like,
I'll
I'm
look
a
into it.
proponent of, like, I believe in state power. It's just like, for me, the problem is, the question is whether it's democratic, not
Yeah,
whether it's like, oh, state or anti-state. It's like,
but I
no,
don't think that's a contradiction.
we're both statists,
Yeah,
and
yeah, like
according to an anarchist.
yeah, again, like this is where like I've been on such a journey because I've been so polluted by anarchism from the capitalist variety that like I'm now like in this camp of like being positively for the state, but viewing the state again like not as a static authoritarian like entity that is disconnected from democracy, aka the people, but like as an institution that can be a vessel for different forces within it. And that's where when you have a tyrannical state, it is because necessarily there's some form of oligarchy that is thus in the vessel of the state versus like how do we develop processes such as a republic, such as universal suffrage to change out and some of the more nuanced conversation you were talking about a legislature, a senate, and so forth. So like that is all well within the purview of Carey, and almost like that's sort of like what he's trying to arrive at is like the state is good. We should use the state, And then it becomes, how do we perfect the state? How do we develop a process? How do we make better intellectuals? So forth and so forth. But it's not running away from the state, which again, I don't want to accuse you of anarchism or libertarianism or anything like that. I'm saying that there is this tendency that as soon as you start talking about like state guidance, state planning, it is like just people recoil and they say, so you want 100% state control of everything and a few guys in the state doing everything. And it's like, that's not what Carey is saying of what the state is. And he's not even saying the state should do everything. It's saying, again, like I said, the body example, he like goes to pains to say like the stomach digests food and, the stomach communicates with the intestines. The state shouldn't be involved with that. Like that is a decentralized process that needs to be given its space. But where the state needs to be involved in the sense that there's a nervous system within the stomach. So if a stomach ache, like it communicates to the brain and the brain can take executive action to sort of determine, well, do I need to take Pepto-Bismol? Like that is kind of what he's getting at, that the state should leave spheres of individual autonomy where they are and like promote decentralization, but where it needs to act, where its natural role is, it needs to be, centralized. It needs to be given its proper due. And I think that's where like our tendency within the West, full of like Anglo liberalism and Cold War polemics, is that as soon as we start getting into that conversation of the state, we just have this reflex where we have this totalitarian view of the state, and it's warranted for certain reasons. But like that is a regression in our ability to sort of keep developing these theories of, well, how do you keep using the state for better? And to whatever degree, like it is actually running away from reality of like the state is the state is what it is. And even if you want to call it like, even like, especially today, like, oh, we just have to let like the free market do what it wants. Well, you know, America's government has enabled the free market in various ways that it's hard to find where the state starts and where the free market ends in that regard. So it's a very perplexing conversation, but this is the point of like figuring out how you have the beautiful contradiction of like centralized state power and like more decentralization for individuals. And so like that's what's so fascinating. And that's where we see like again like a little bit of Hegel kind of manifest out of what Carey is trying to say there.
Yeah, I do have to go now, by the way. It's
Okay.
like I'm past my time. I'm quite
Sorry about that.
but it was a interesting discussion. Um, it is a very interesting discussion, a lot of things to think about. Although not what I expected in terms of lots of economics.
Yeah, we'll do a part two to cover your recent analysis of the origin of woke, perhaps. But no, I really appreciate the conversation, and I'll probably quote you in my next upcoming essay that a lot of these ideas are going to be presented. Because yeah, this has been reading and watching your content has been educational in definitely trying to correct my right-wing priors of perceiving Marxism. And so, yeah, I'm grateful for your content for that and this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for sharing the Substack stuff. I'm trying. I've the Substack for me is new, so I'm new to Substack. I literally made it pretty recently, so I want more people to check that out because that's like gets way less traction than my like videos.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I found like, your content's evergreen in a set, like keep quoting the sentences that like really pop to people because, people see a long essay and again, they kind of don't click it right away. But if you like, there's so many quotes you have that are very excellent that make sure you like get that out to the public so they can just at least get that soundbite to capture them, to pull them into the funnel.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I saw you share a lot of the communism to capitalism convergence,
Yeah,
especially.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Because you'll see in my next essay, you'll hopefully it will give you more structure for the thoughts that I've been presenting today. So then finally, do you have anything you'd like to plug? Any last statement to tell the listeners?
Yeah, check out the Substack One Dime Review and the podcast One Dime Radio. There's also the main channel if you want to dive into MMT, deficit myth, problem with taxing the rich. And I have an upcoming one on the political economy of China. It's called just going to be titled How China Works. And yeah, but definitely check the Substack because I could use more followers on Substack. That's for sure. So yeah, thanks for having me.